Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Nightmare Narratives. I can picture some of you already in bed, maybe some of you just getting home from work. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, I'm glad you're here. If this helps you relax or sleep, please like and subscribe. It means a lot. Now let's get you comfortable, and I'll tell you tonight's story. My name is Eugene Mountainheart, and I've been a park ranger in these West Virginia mountains for 17 years now. That's long enough to see things that would make most folks pack up and head back to the city. But what happened in October of '77, up in the Dolly Sods? Well, that changed everything I thought I knew about these mountains. I come from mountain people. My grandfather worked these ridges, and my father before me. We Mountainhearts know every trail, every creek, every cave from here to the state line. I've pulled 847 people out of trouble in these woods, lost hikers, broken bones, heart attacks, you name it. I know how to read weather, how to track, how to survive when everything goes wrong. Point is, I'm not some city boy who jumps at shadows. The Dolly Sods is different from the rest of the forest. It sits up on a plateau at 4,000 feet, all covered in ancient bogs and twisted trees. The red spruce up there grow all bent and gnarled from the wind. Fog rolls in, without warning, and the silence. Well, it's the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring, like the mountain itself is holding its breath. Local folks have always said strange things about the high bogs. Old-timers call them the hollering places because voices carry funny up there. Sound bounces off the rocks and swirls around in ways that don't make sense. My grandmother used to tell stories about spirits that lived in the bogs, things that could copy your voice to trick people. But those were just stories to keep kids from wandering off. At least, that's what I thought. It started on October 3rd, when 3 college kids from Pittsburgh didn't come back from their camping trip. Geology students, smart kids who knew how to handle themselves outdoors. They'd gotten permits for a week-long study of the bog formations up on the plateau. When they missed their check-in date, their professor called it in. Standard missing persons protocol in the backcountry. I'd done it hundreds of times. Pack extra gear, plot a search grid, coordinate with state police. My partner Jake Riversong met me at the trailhead at first light. Jake's Cherokee, been ranging almost as long as me. If anyone could track those kids, it was us. The hike up to their campsite takes about 6 hours if you know the trails. We made good time, even with the heavy packs. Weather was turning cold early that year. Temperature had dropped 20 degrees overnight, and there was ice forming on the puddles. Not unusual for October in the high country, but it made me worry about the students. We found their camp just before noon. That's when things started feeling wrong. The tents were still there, perfectly set up in a neat triangle around a cold fire pit. All their gear was laid out like they'd just stepped away for a minute. But here's the thing that made my skin crawl. Every single item was arranged in perfect circles. Sleeping bags rolled and placed in circles, cooking pots stacked in circles. Even their boots were lined up in little circles around each tent. Kids don't camp like this, Jake said, walking around the site. He was right. College students are messy. They leave gear scattered, food half-eaten, clothes hanging on branches. This looked like someone had come through and organized everything with a ruler. I called out their names. Jennifer, Mark, and David. My voice echoed weird off the rock formations, coming back all twisted and layered. Jake shot me a look. "Don't like how that sounds," he said. We spent 2 hours searching the area around the camp, found their tracks leading away from the site, heading toward the big bog to the east. The prints were clear in the soft ground, 3 sets of hiking boots, walking in single file. But about 50 yards from camp, something strange happened to those tracks. They started going in circles. Perfect circles, maybe 30 feet across. Round and round, like the 3 of them had. Just started walking in circles for no reason. The tracks went around maybe 10 times, getting closer to the center with each loop. Then, they just stopped. Right at the edge of the bog, the footprints ended like the students had vanished into thin air. Jake knelt down by the last footprint. "This doesn't make sense, Gene. Look at this." The final track was pressed deep into the mud, deeper than a normal step. Like someone had been standing there for a long time, or like they'd been pulled down into the earth. That's when we heard it. A voice calling from somewhere out in the bog. Faint, but clear enough to make out words. "Help us, please, we're lost." It was a woman's voice, young, scared. Had to be Jennifer, one of the missing students. I grabbed my radio to call for backup, but all I got was static, mixed with something that sounded like voices talking backwards. The compass on my belt was spinning like a broken toy. "Something's wrong with the gear," I told Jake. He was staring out at the fog rolling over the bog. "It's not the gear," he said quietly. "My people have stories about places like this. Voice stealers, things that live in the old swamps and copy human sounds to hunt." I'd known Jake for 10 years, and he wasn't the type to spook easy. But right then, he looked genuinely afraid. The voice came again, closer this time. "Help, we're stuck. Can you hear us?" It definitely sounded like a young woman in trouble, but something about it made my teeth ache. The words were right, but the rhythm was off. Like someone reading lines without understanding what they meant. "We have to check it out," I said, even though every instinct I had was screaming at me to get out of there. Jake nodded, but his hand went to the medicine pouch he always wore. "Stay close, Gene, and whatever we hear out there, that's not those kids." The bog stretched out in front of us like a moonscape. Patches of dark water reflected the ken. Gray sky between islands of sphagnum moss and cranberry bushes. The ground felt spongy under our boots, and with each step, methane bubbles rose to the surface with soft plopping sounds. We followed a game trail that wound between the deeper pools. The fog was getting thicker, cutting our visibility to maybe 20 feet. Everything looked the same: twisted red spruce, dark water, moss-covered logs that could have been there for 1,000 years. "Help us, over here." The voice was definitely closer now, maybe 50 yards to our left, but when I looked that way, all I could see was fog and the dark outline of dead trees. "Jennifer," I called out, "where are you? We're stuck. We can't move." Jake grabbed my arm. "Listen to it, Gene. Really listen." I stopped and focused on the voice. That's when I heard what Jake meant. The words were perfect English, but there was no emotion behind them. No real fear, no exhaustion, no relief at hearing rescuers. It was like listening to a recording of someone asking for help. We kept moving toward the sound, stepping carefully on the floating moss mats. One wrong step, and you could sink waist-deep in bog water that never sees sunlight. I'd pulled enough people out of these holes to know how fast the cold could kill you. "There," Jake pointed ahead. Movement in the fog. I saw it too, a pale shape moving between the trees. Human-sized, but moving wrong. Too smooth, like it was gliding instead of walking. "Jennifer, is that you?" The shape stopped. Then slowly, it turned toward us. Even through the fog, I could see it wasn't human. Too tall, arms too long, skin the color of old bone. And its throat. Something was wrong with its throat. It bulged out like a frog's, pulsing with each breath. "Help us," it said in Jennifer's voice. "We're lost." The thing's mouth didn't move when it spoke. I went for my service weapon, but Jake was already backing away. "Run," he whispered. "Run, now." The creature tilted its head, and I heard something that made my blood freeze. My own voice, calling out from somewhere behind us. "Jake, over here." I found them, but I was standing right there. I wasn't calling anything. "Jake, this way." My voice again, coming from 3 different directions now. Each one sounded exactly right, down to the slight rasp I get when I'm excited. If I'd been alone in the fog, I would have followed those calls, thinking I was somehow hearing an echo. Jake grabbed my sleeve and pulled me toward what looked like solid ground. We stumbled through the cranberry bushes, boots squelching in the wet moss. Behind us, I could hear more voices calling out, Jennifer asking for help, Mark shouting directions, David crying for his mother. But underneath those voices, I started hearing something else, something that made my knees weak, my brother Tommy's voice. Tommy died when he was 7 years old, fell through ice on Miller's Pond while we were skating. That was 31 years ago. I still remembered exactly how his voice sounded when he was scared. Gene, help me, I can't get out." The same words he'd screamed that day on the pond, right before the ice took him under. I stopped running. "Gene, what are you doing?" Jake was pulling at my arm, but I couldn't move. That was my little brother calling for help. I'd failed him once. I couldn't do it again. "Gene, the ice is breaking. Help me. It's not him, Jake said firmly. Whatever's out there, it's using your memories against you. That's how they hunt. But Tommy sounded so real, so scared. Just like that winter day when I was 10 years old and couldn't reach him in time. Please, Gene, don't leave me. I took a step toward the voice before Jake slammed his shoulder into me, knocking me sideways into a patch of solid ground. Snap out of it, he shouted. Look around. I shook my head and really looked at our surroundings for the first time since entering the bog. We were standing on a small island of firm ground, maybe 10 feet across. But floating in the dark water around us were white shapes. Dozens of them. Bodies, old bodies, preserved by the acid bog water. Some looked recent, hiking clothes, modern backpacks still strapped to their shoulders. Others were older, dressed in clothes from decades past. All of them were perfectly preserved, skin white as fish bellies, staring up at us with black, empty eye sockets. And every single one had their throat torn open. Jesus Christ, I whispered. The voices around us were getting louder now. Jennifer, Mark, David, my brother Tommy, and dozens of others I didn't recognize. Men, women, children, all calling for help in perfect, emotionless voices. We need to get out of here, Jake said. Now. We started moving again, jumping from one solid patch to the next. The fog was so thick now I could barely see Jake 3 feet in front of me. The voices followed us, always just out of sight, calling out for help in words that meant nothing. That's when I saw the tracks. Fresh boot prints in the mud, leading away from the bodies. 3 sets, just like at the campsite. Jennifer, Mark, and David. But these tracks weren't walking away from the bog. They were walking into it. Deeper and deeper, until the prints disappeared under the black water. Jake, I called softly. I think I know what happened to those kids. He turned back to look at the tracks, and his face went pale. They heard voices too, familiar voices, calling them into the deep water. A new voice joined the chorus then, young, male, with a slight Pittsburgh accent. Mom? Mom, is that you? I can see you. Mark, one of the missing students. But his voice was coming from under the water. I looked down at the bog beneath our feet. There, maybe 6 feet down in the dark water, I could see a pale face looking up at us. Mark's face, eyes open, mouth moving like he was still trying to call for help. But no bubbles came up, no sound from below. The voice was coming from somewhere else entirely. Mom, don't leave me down here. That's when I understood. The things in the fog weren't just copying voices. They were stealing them, taking them from the dead and using them to hunt the living. And somewhere out in that bog, floating with all the other bodies, Jennifer and David were still trying to call for help. Their voices trapped forever, being used to lure the next victims into the water. The fog parted for just a moment, and I got a clear look at the thing that had been following us. 7 feet tall, thin as a scarecrow, with skin like wet clay. Its throat was swollen to 3 times normal size, pulsing and moving like something alive was trapped inside. It opened its mouth, and Jennifer's voice came out. Please help us, we're so scared. Then Mark's voice. Mom, I want to come home. Then Tommy's. Gene, why didn't you save me? Jake pulled out a small leather pouch and started singing something in Cherokee. Low and rhythmic, words I didn't understand, but that seemed to push back against the fog. The creature took a step backward. Keep singing, I told him. Whatever you're doing, it doesn't like it. But even as the thing retreated, I could hear more voices joining the chorus. Dozens of them now. All the people who disappeared in these mountains over the years. All of them calling out from the dark water, their voices stolen and twisted into hunting calls. And in the distance, I could see more shapes moving through the fog. Tall, pale shapes with bulging throats, coming toward us from every direction. We weren't just dealing with one creature. We were surrounded by a whole nest of them. Jake's singing grew stronger as the pale creatures closed in around us. His voice seemed to create a bubble of clear air, pushing back the fog, and keeping the things at a distance. But I could see at least 6 of them now, circling us like wolves. How long can you keep that up? I asked. Not long enough. He panted between verses. The voices were getting more aggressive, more desperate. I heard my mother calling my name, my ex-wife begging me to come home, even my old drill sergeant from basic training shouting orders. Every voice from my past, perfectly copied, all trying to get me to step off our little island of safety. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Jake's Cherokee song was keeping the creatures back, but the water level around our island was rising. The bog was flooding, slowly but steadily. In maybe 20 minutes, we'd be standing in waist-deep water with nowhere to run. They're not just hunting us, I realized. They're hurting us, driving us into deeper water where they can take us easier. Jake nodded grimly, but kept singing. One of the creatures stepped forward, testing the edge of his protective song. When it hit the barrier, its throat bulged even more, and my father's voice came out. "Eugene, you always were a disappointment, just like when you let Tommy die." Those words hit harder than any physical blow. My father had never said anything like that, but the voice was perfect. Every inflection, every pause, exactly right. "Don't listen," Jake managed between verses. "It's reading your pain." But more voices joined in. My grandmother telling me I was worthless, my first girlfriend laughing at me, Tommy crying, saying it was my fault he drowned. I could feel myself starting to crack. The guilt I'd carried for 30 years was being used against me, amplified and twisted until I could barely stand. "I have to help him," I whispered, taking a step toward the water. Jake grabbed me without breaking his song. Through his medicine pouch, he pulled out a small chunk of iron ore and pressed it into my hand. The moment the metal touched my skin, the voices became muffled, distant. "Iron breaks their power," he said quickly. "My grandfather taught me. These things are old, from before iron came to the mountains." I gripped the iron tight and felt my head clear. The creatures were still there, still circling, but their voices had less power over me. That's when we heard the helicopter. The distant thrum of rotors echoed across the bog, getting closer. Someone had finally gotten worried enough to send air support, but instead of relief, I felt pure terror. The rescue team would hear the voices too. They'd try to help, and they'd end up just like Jennifer, Mark, and David. I pulled out my emergency flare and fired it into the sky. The red light cut through the fog like a knife, and I heard the helicopter change direction, heading straight for us. "No," I called out, waving my arms. "Stay back, don't land." But my voice was lost in the engine noise. The chopper came in low, looking for a good place to set down. That's when the creatures made their move. All 6 of them started calling out at once, but not random voices this time. They'd somehow learned to mimic the radio protocols, the standard emergency responses. "This is Ranger Mountain Heart," my own voice called from the fog. "We have multiple casualties. Need immediate medical evacuation." "Roger that," came the pilot's voice over the radio. "Setting down now." "No." I screamed into my radio, but it was just static. The iron in my hand was disrupting my own equipment too. The helicopter touched down on what looked like solid ground about 100 yards away. 2 paramedics jumped out, running toward the voices, calling for help. I watched in horror as they disappeared into the fog, following the false distress calls. Within minutes, I could hear their voices too, calling out from the dark water, begging their families to come save them. "We have to do something," I told Jake. His song was getting weaker. Sweat was pouring down his face, and I could see him starting to shake from exhaustion. "The iron," he gasped. "If we can get a big piece to the center of their nest, break the whole thing." I looked around desperately. The helicopter was still sitting there, rotors spinning, pilot probably wondering where his crew went. Helicopters have lots of iron, the engine, the frame, the rotor assembly. "Can you hold them for 2 more minutes?" Jake nodded, though I could see it was costing him everything. I splashed into the knee-deep water, moving as fast as I could toward the helicopter. The voices followed me, but the iron ore in my hand kept them at bay. Behind me, I could hear Jake's song getting more desperate, more strained. The pilot saw me coming and opened the door. "Where are my guys? What's going on out there?" "Radio for backup," I shouted over the engine noise. "Tell them to bring iron, lots of it. Railroad spikes, rebar, anything." "What the hell are you talking about?" I didn't have time to explain. The water around the helicopter was getting deeper, and I could see pale shapes moving underneath the surface. The creatures were trying to flood the entire area, turn it all into their hunting ground. "Just do it." I grabbed the helicopter's toolkit and pulled out a crowbar. Solid iron, about 3 feet long. When I turned back toward Jake, my heart stopped. He was gone. The island where we'd been standing was empty, except for his hat floating on the dark water. His song had stopped, and the fog was closing in fast. But I could hear his voice now, calling from the bog. "Gene, over here, I found a way out." Perfect Cherokee accent, exact same inflection he always used. But Jake was floating 6 feet underwater with the rest of them. I was alone with 6 throat-swollen monsters and their stolen voice collection, standing waist-deep in freezing bog water with nothing but a crowbar and a chunk of iron ore. The helicopter pilot was screaming into his radio, trying to raise anyone who could make sense of what was happening. But I knew no backup was coming. Not in time. The creatures started moving in, and this time they brought every voice they'd ever stolen. Men, women, children, all calling my name, all begging for help, all trying to lure me into the deeper water where they could add my voice to their collection. But as they got closer, I noticed something important. They weren't just randomly using voices. They were using the voices of people I'd failed to save, a hiker I'd found 3 days too late, a climber who'd fallen while I was on another call, a little girl who'd drowned in a flash flood because I couldn't reach her in time, every rescue that had gone wrong, every person I couldn't save. This wasn't random hunting, it was personal. These things had been watching me for years, learning my failures, collecting the voices of my guilt, and now they wanted to add my voice to their chorus, to use my calls for help to lure other rangers into the bog. The largest creature stepped forward, its throat so swollen it looked like it might burst. When it opened its mouth, Tommy's 7-year-old voice came out, crystal clear. "Gene, I forgive you for letting me die, but you have to come help the others now. They're all waiting for you down here in the cold, dark water." I raised the crowbar, though I had no idea if iron could actually hurt these things. "Come on," I said, surprised by how steady my own voice sounded. "Let's see whose voice you steal next." The largest creature moved closer, its bulging throat pulsing with each stolen voice it contained. I could see now that the swelling wasn't natural, it was full of something. Things moving under the skin, like trapped birds. "Gene," it said in Tommy's voice, "remember when we used to sing together? Mama's hymns in the old church?" That stopped me cold. "Tommy?" "And I used to sing hymns with our grandmother every Sunday at the little mountain church. Old songs, older than the mountains themselves. Songs our great-grandmother had brought over from Ireland. 'Come Down the Mountain' was Tommy's favorite. He'd sing it while we walked the ridge trails, his little voice echoing off the rocks. The creature's throat bulged larger. "Sing with me, Gene, like old times." But as it spoke, I realized something. It could copy voices perfectly, but it didn't understand what the words meant. When it said Mama's hymns, there was no warmth, no memory behind it. Just sound. "You don't know the words, do you?" I said. "You can steal voices, but you can't steal souls." The thing tilted its head, confused. That's when I remembered what Jake had said about pure song driving them away. Not just any song, religious song, holy song, songs with real meaning behind them. I started singing the hymn Tommy loved, the one our grandmother had taught. "Come down the mountain, children, come home, leave behind your wandering, leave behind your roam. The light of salvation will guide you back. Come down the mountain, stay on the track." My voice was rough, untrained, but I put everything into it. Every memory of Tommy, every Sunday morning with grandmother, every time I'd found my way home through these mountains. The creature staggered backward like I'd hit it with the crowbar. Its throat started deflating, and I could hear voices escaping, screams and cries and calls for help streaming out like air from a punctured balloon. "That's it," I whispered, then sang louder. The other creatures were backing away too, their stolen voices becoming distorted, warped. But the largest one wasn't giving up. Its throat swelled even bigger, and suddenly every voice it had ever stolen started talking at once. A cacophony of stolen words, stolen pain, stolen final moments. Dozens of people, all talking over each other, all begging for help that never came. The sound was so horrible, I almost dropped to my knees. But underneath all those voices, I heard something else, a pattern. They weren't just random cries for help. They were trying to harmonize. The creature was attempting to sing back, using its stolen voices to create some kind of counter-song. But it couldn't make the voices work together. They were all individual, all separate, all singing different songs of pain and terror. I kept singing the hymn, adding more verses as I remembered them. Songs about coming home, about finding peace, about the light that guides lost children back to safety. One by one, the stolen voices in the creature's throat started joining my song instead of fighting it. I heard Jennifer's voice, young and pure, picking up the melody, Mark's voice adding harmony. The paramedics from the helicopter, their voices finding peace in the old words. Even Tommy's voice, sweet and clear like I remembered from our childhood, singing along with his big brother one last time. The creature's throat was collapsing now, deflating like a punctured tire. But as each stolen voice found peace in the hymn, it escaped upward, free. The fog around us started lifting. The dark water began draining away, revealing the true bottom of the bog. Hundreds of bodies, preserved in the acidic water for who knows how long. Some recent, some decades old, some that might have been there since the first settlers came to these mountains. But they weren't floating anymore. They were sinking, finally allowed to rest. The largest creature made one last desperate attempt, using my own voice to sing a twisted version of the hymn. But it got the words wrong, mixing up verses, adding curses where there should be blessings. I walked closer, still singing, and touched the iron crowbar to its bloated throat. The effect was immediate and horrible. The creature's throat split open like an overripe fruit, and hundreds of glowing lights poured out, the stolen voices, finally free to find their way home. The thing collapsed into the draining bog water, its pale skin dissolving like wet paper. The other creatures were backing away now, their own throats deflating, their stolen voices escaping in streams of light that rose up through the clearing fog. I kept singing until every light had disappeared into the sky, until every stolen voice had found its peace. When silence finally returned to the bog, it was a different kind of quiet, not the oppressive, waiting silence from before, but the natural quiet of a forest at rest. The helicopter pilot was calling my name from his radio. Real concern, in his real voice, not some twisted mimicry. "I'm here," I called back. And this time my radio worked perfectly. "Where are my medics? What happened to my crew?" I looked down at the bodies now resting peacefully at the bottom of the drained bog. Jennifer, Mark, David, the two paramedics, and hundreds of others stretching back through decades. "We're going to need a lot more body bags," I told him. But as I walked back toward the helicopter, I heard one last voice calling from behind me. Soft, peaceful, full of love. "Thank you, Jean. Thank you for letting us go home." Tommy's voice, but different now. Free. Forgiven, finally at peace. I didn't turn around. Some goodbyes are meant to be heard, not seen. The official report called it a catastrophic bog failure caused by unusual seismic activity. They said the college students and rescue personnel had been trapped when an underground pocket of methane gas exploded, causing the bog to drain suddenly. Neat, scientific, believable. They never asked me about the voices. The state closed the dolly sods for 6 months while they recovered the bodies. They found 127 sets of remains total, some dating back to the 1800s. Missing hikers, lost hunters, people who'd just vanished over the decades. The official cause of death for all of them was drowning, though the coroner privately told me that every single throat had been damaged in the same strange way. Like something had been living inside them. I never mentioned the creatures. What would be the point? Who would believe me? They gave me a commendation for bravery and recommended I take some time off for trauma counseling. I took the time off, but I never went to counseling. How do you explain to a therapist that you can still hear stolen voices calling from empty bogs? Because I can still hear them. Not every night, but often enough. Usually when the moon is full and the fog rolls heavy through the hollows. Voices calling for help from places where no one should be. I've changed how I do my job now. When I get reports of missing hikers, I listen carefully to the description of the voices calling for help. If the caller says the voice sounded off somehow, if they mention voices with no emotion, behind them, I request immediate backup. And I always carry iron now. A railroad spike in my belt, iron filings in my pocket, just in case. The thing is, these mountains are old. Older than the Cherokee, older than any human memory. And in the deep places, the wet places, the quiet places where fog gathers and voices echo strange, well, some things have been here a lot longer than we have. 3 months after the incident, I was called to investigate another missing persons case. A family of 4 who'd gone camping up near Seneca Rocks. The last transmission from their radio was a request for help, saying they'd found an injured hiker who needed assistance. When I got to their campsite, I found all their gear arranged in perfect circles around the fire pit. I've never moved so fast in my life getting out of there. Last week, I put in for early retirement. 17 years is long enough in these mountains. Maybe it's time to find some work down in the valleys, where the only voices you hear are the ones attached to living throats. But sometimes, late at night when the fog rolls in, I still hear Tommy singing that old hymn. Not stolen now, not twisted into something hungry and wrong. Just my little brother's voice, pure and happy, the way I remember it from before the ice took him. And sometimes I sing along, adding my voice to his across the years and the darkness. Some voices, once you set them free, never really leave you. And maybe that's the way it should be. My name is Virginia Thornberry, but everyone calls me Ginny. I've been fighting fires in these Virginia mountains for 13 years now, and I thought I'd seen everything these woods could throw at me. George Washington National Forest can be a dangerous place. Steep ridges, dense timber, and during drought season like we had in the summer of '84, everything becomes a tinderbox waiting for one spark. I grew up in these mountains, learned every trail and fire break before I was old enough to drive. After I left my ex-husband, well, after I escaped him is more like it, I found peace in the wilderness. The mountains don't lie to you or hurt you if you respect them. They just are what they are. That July morning started like any other. The heat was already pressing down at 6 a.m., and the humidity made my ranger uniform stick to my skin. I'd been checking the drought monitors all week. We were in the red zone, meaning any fire could spread fast and far. The radio in my truck crackled as I drove the winding forest roads, listening to weather reports and fire danger updates. "Thornberry, you copy?" came the voice of dispatch. "Copy. This is Thornberry. Got a report of an illegal campfire up in the Laurel country, about 12 miles past Miller's Gap. Can you check it out?" I sighed. The Laurel country. That's what we called the thick patches of mountain laurel that grew so dense you couldn't see 5 feet in any direction. The Cherokee used to call them laurel hells, because once you got turned around in there, you might wander in circles for days. The branches grew so thick overhead they blocked out most of the sun, creating a green twilight even at noon. 10:04. ETA about 40 minutes. I grabbed my gear, my Pulaski fire axe, first aid kit, citation book, and radio, and headed deeper into the mountains. The road got narrower and bumpier as I climbed, until finally I had to park and hike the last 2 miles. The forest felt wrong that morning. I'd walked these trails hundreds of times, but something was different. The birds weren't singing. Usually you'd hear woodpeckers and jays, maybe a hawk calling from the ridges. But the woods were silent, except for my boots on the dry leaves. When I reached the coordinates dispatch had given me, I found the campfire ring easily enough. It was built right, stones arranged in a proper circle, but the ashes were stone cold. I knelt down and stirred them with a stick. They'd been cold for hours, maybe even days. That's when I noticed the footprints. Boot prints in the dry dirt, leading away from the fire and straight into the thickest patch of laurel I'd ever seen. The branches had grown together so tight they formed tunnels, dark green passages that twisted and turned until you couldn't see where they led. I followed the tracks to the edge of the laurel hell. The branches formed a natural archway, like a doorway into a green cave. Cool air drifted out from inside, which should have felt good in the heat, but instead made me shiver. "Hello?" I called out. "Forest Service. I need to speak with whoever made this campfire." No answer. Just that strange, muffled quiet you get inside thick vegetation. Like being buried alive under a green blanket. I checked my radio. The signal was weak, but still working. "Dispatch, this is Thornberry. Found the campfire site, but no campers. Tracks lead into heavy laurel. I'm going to follow them and make contact." "Copy that. Check in every 30 minutes." I switched on my flashlight and pushed through the laurel branches. The tunnel was just wide enough for one person, with thorns catching at my uniform. The air smelled of old leaves and something else, something like smoke, but not quite. After about 50 yards, the tunnel split into 3 different paths. I knelt down to look for tracks, but the ground was covered in thick moss and old leaves. No way to tell which way the campers had gone. I chose the middle path and kept walking. The tunnel curved and twisted, sometimes opening up into small clearings before narrowing again. I checked my GPS, but the signal kept cutting out under the thick canopy. That's when I heard it, voices up ahead, calling out. Couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like people in distress. "Hello," I shouted back. "Forest Service, are you hurt?" The voices stopped, complete silence. I pushed forward faster, branches scraping against my arms. The tunnel turned sharply left, then right, then left again. I was starting to lose track of the turns when I came to another split. This time 5 different paths leading off in different directions. I checked my watch. I'd been in here for 20 minutes, but it felt like much longer. Time to head back and call for backup. But when I turned around, the tunnel behind me had changed. Where there had been 1 path leading back, now there were 3. And none of them looked familiar. I stood there, staring at the 3 tunnels, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. In 13 years of forest work, I'd never gotten turned around this badly. I had a compass, and it showed north, but that didn't help when I couldn't remember which direction I'd come from. "Stay calm, Ginny," I said out loud. "You've been through worse." I pulled out my radio. "Dispatch, this is Thornberry." Static. I tried adjusting the antenna, but the signal was completely gone. The thick laurel was blocking everything. I picked the tunnel that felt most familiar and started walking. The path twisted and turned for what seemed like forever, until I came to a clearing about 20 feet across. In the center was a circle of stones, but not like the campfire ring I'd found earlier. These stones were arranged in a perfect spiral, with the biggest one in the middle. On top of the center stone sat a pile of bones. I moved closer, keeping my hand on my Pulaski. The bones were small, looked like they came from rabbits or squirrels. They were arranged carefully, almost like an offering. The stones around them were blackened as if they'd been burned, but there was no ash, no sign of recent fire. "What the hell?" I muttered. That's when I heard the voices again, clearer this time. They were coming from deeper in the laurel, and now I could make out words. "Help us, we're lost, can't find the way." I called back, "Keep talking, I'll find you." But the voices faded away, like they were moving further off. I left the spiral clearing and pushed deeper into the laurel hell. The tunnels were getting narrower, and the air was getting colder. My flashlight beam seemed dimmer too, even though I'd put in fresh batteries that morning. The path split again, and this time I saw something that made my blood run cold. There were fresh boot prints in the moss, the same prints I'd followed from the campfire. But they were going in both directions, like someone had walked the same path back and forth, over and over. I followed the prints to the right. The tunnel curved around and opened into another clearing, smaller than the first. This one had a circle of stones too, but these were arranged differently, more like a cage than a spiral. And inside the stone circle was a backpack. It was an old hiking pack, the kind they used to make in the 60 seconds. The fabric was rotted and covered in moss, like it had been there for years. I knelt down and carefully opened it. Inside were the usual hiking supplies, a water bottle, some moldy food, a map of the forest. But the map was wrong. It showed trails that didn't exist and left out roads I knew were there. And the date on the map was 1967. At the bottom of the pack was a wallet. The driver's license inside showed a young man named Robert Chen, age 23. The license was from 1967, and it was issued in California. Robert Chen. I knew that name. He'd been one of the missing hikers from the late 60 seconds, part of a group that had disappeared somewhere in the national forest. They'd never found the bodies, just abandoned cars in the parking areas. I stood up fast, my heart pounding. This couldn't be right. If Robert Chen had been missing since 1967, how were his things still here? And why did they look like they'd only been sitting out for a few months? That's when I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around, pulling my flashlight up. At the edge of the clearing, just barely visible in the green shadows, was a figure. It looked like a man, But something was wrong with the way he moved. Too slow, like he was walking underwater. "Robert?" I called out. "Robert Chen?" The figure stopped. Slowly, it turned toward me. I couldn't make out the face in the shadows, but I could see it was wearing old hiking clothes, the same style as the gear in the backpack. "Are you lost?" I asked, taking a step forward. The figure raised one hand, pointing deeper into the laurel. Then it turned and walked away, disappearing into the green tunnels. I followed, pushing through the branches as fast as I could, but when I reached the spot where the figure had been, there was nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing to show that anyone had been there. My radio crackled to life. "Thornberry, this is dispatch. Check in." I grabbed the radio, relief flooding through me. "Dispatch, I'm here. Signal's been cutting out. You're about an hour overdue for check-in. What's your status?" I looked around at the green tunnels surrounding me. I'm having some navigation issues. The laurel is thicker than expected. I may need backup." "Copy that. Can you make it back to your vehicle?" I tried to sound confident. "Affirmative. Give me another hour." But as I said it, I realized I had no idea which way led back to my truck. The tunnels all looked the same now, and my compass seemed to be spinning. Randomly, I picked a path and started walking, but after 20 minutes, I came to another clearing with another stone circle. This one had a different backpack in it, newer, from the 72nds maybe. And when I opened it, I found another wallet, another missing person. Susan Martinez, age 19, missing since 1974. That's when I realized the truth. This wasn't just a laurel hell, it was a trap. And I was walking deeper into it. I backed away from Susan Martinez's backpack like it was going to bite me. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my radio again. "Dispatch, this is Thornberry. I need immediate backup at my location." Nothing but static. I tried again. "Mayday, mayday, officer needs assistance." Still nothing. The radio was dead. I was starting to panic, which is the worst thing a ranger can do in an emergency situation. I forced myself to take deep breaths and think logically. People had been getting lost in these laurel hells for decades. That's why they had the name. But people also got found. I just needed to stay calm and work my way out systematically. I marked the clearing with my Pulaski, chopping a clear X into the largest tree. Then I picked the tunnel that seemed to head downhill. Water flows down, and water eventually leads to streams, and streams lead to roads. But after an hour of walking, I came to another clearing, and there was my X, carved into the same tree. I'd walked in a complete circle. "That's impossible," I told myself. I'd been going downhill the whole time, taking right turns at every junction. There was no way I could end up in the same place. I tried a different approach. This time, I went uphill, taking left turns. After another hour of walking through the twisted green tunnels, I came to a clearing. It was the same clearing. Same stone circle, same backpack, same X carved in the tree. I sat down hard on the mossy ground, trying to understand what was happening to me. Heat exhaustion, maybe? Dehydration? I'd heard of people getting so disoriented they walked in circles without knowing it. But I'd been careful. I'd been marking my turns, following my compass. And the compass was working fine. It pointed north every time I checked it. That's when I heard the voices again. This time they were all around me, coming from every tunnel at once. "Help us. We're lost too. Been walking for so long." I stood up and called out, "Where are you? I can hear you, but I can't see you." "In the tunnels. Always in the tunnels. Can't get out." The voices were getting clearer. I could make out different people. A man with a southern accent, a young woman who sounded scared, an older man who kept coughing. "How long have you been here?" I shouted. "Since 1967, since 1974, since 1981, since yesterday." My blood went cold. These were the missing hikers, all of them, trapped in this impossible maze of laurel, tunnels, walking in circles for years, for decades. I grabbed my Pulaski and started hacking at the laurel branches, trying to cut a straight path out. But as fast as I cut, the branches seemed to grow back. The tunnels were reforming behind my axe blade. "That won't work," said a voice right behind me. I spun around. A woman stood at the edge of the clearing, young, maybe 20, wearing bell-bottom jeans and a tie-dyed shirt. She looked solid, real, but her skin had a gray tint to it, like she'd been underground for a long time. "Susan?" I whispered. "Susan Martinez?" She nodded. "I've been trying to get out since 1974. We all have." "We?" Other figures started emerging from the tunnels. A young Asian man in old hiking gear, Robert Chen. An older man in work clothes, a teenage boy with a backpack. A middle-aged woman in a park ranger uniform from the 1952nd. "How many of you are there?" I asked. "Dozens," Susan said, "maybe hundreds. People have been getting lost in the Laurel Hell for a long time. Longer than the Cherokee, remember." "But this is impossible," I said. "People don't just disappear. Search teams, helicopters." "They search," said Robert Chen. "But they can't find us. This place, it's not really part of the world anymore. It's something else." "What do you mean?" The old ranger stepped forward. Her uniform was different from mine, with patches I didn't recognize. "Name's Betty Hawkins. I disappeared in 1953 while investigating reports of strange fires in the Laurel country. Took me a while to understand what this place really is. Which is? A trap. A spirit trap. Something old and angry lives at the center of this maze. It feeds on people who get lost, feeds on their fear, their confusion, their desperation." "That's crazy," I said, but even as I said it, I knew it wasn't. I'd felt it myself, the wrongness in the air, the way the tunnels seemed to shift when you weren't looking. Cherokee tried to warn people, Betty continued. They had ceremonies to keep it contained. But white settlers didn't listen. They thought the warnings were just superstition. "So what happens to us?" I asked. "Do we just stay here forever?" Susan nodded sadly. "We walk the tunnels. We call out to new people who get lost, hoping someone will find a way out. But no one ever does." "There has to be a way," I said. "There's always a way." "The spirit gets stronger with each person it traps," Robert said. "The maze gets bigger, more complex. It's been growing for over a century." I looked around at the lost souls surrounding me. They all had the same look in their eyes, hopelessness, resignation. They'd given up. But I wasn't ready to give up. I was a forest ranger. I'd fought fires that seemed unstoppable, rescued hikers from impossible situations. I didn't believe in no-win scenarios. "This spirit," I said to Betty. "Where is it exactly?" "At the center of the maze." "But the center moves. It's never in the same place twice." "How do you know?" "Some of us have tried to find it. The ones who get close, they don't come back." I thought about that. A spirit that controlled a maze, that fed on lost souls. In all the Cherokee legends I'd heard growing up, spirits like that had one weakness. They were bound to their territory by whatever created them in the first place. "Betty, you said something about strange fires when you disappeared. What kind of fires?" "Cold fires. Flames that burned blue and didn't give off heat. They'd appear in the Laurel and burn for days without consuming anything." "And the Cherokee ceremonies to contain it?" "Fire ceremonies. Controlled burns to keep the Laurel from growing too thick." Fire. That was the key. The spirit was bound to the Laurel Hell. But fire could break that binding. Not just any fire, controlled fire, the kind I'd been training to use my entire career. I looked around at the lost souls. "I'm going to get us out of here." "Ginny," Susan said gently, "we've all tried." "No," I said, pulling my gear closer. "You've tried to escape the maze, but I'm going to destroy it." The lost souls stared at me like I'd lost my mind. Maybe I had. But I knew fires, and I knew the forest. If this spirit was bound to the Laurel Hell, then I could break that binding. "I need to get to the center," I told them. "The real center, where the spirit lives." "It's too dangerous," Betty warned. "The closer you get to the center, the stronger it becomes. The maze itself fights you. Then I'll fight back." I opened my gear bag and pulled out my emergency fire kit, waterproof matches, fire paste, chemical starters. Every ranger carried enough supplies to start a signal fire or a controlled burn in an emergency. "Fire won't work," Robert said. "We've tried. The branches are too green, too thick with moisture." "You've tried regular fire." "I'm talking about a controlled burn." with chemical accelerants, hot enough to burn green wood. I started moving toward one of the tunnels, but Susan grabbed my arm. "Ginny, please, don't do this. We've lost too many people trying to fight it. Just stay with us. It's not so bad after a while. You forget about the outside world." I looked at her. This young woman who'd been trapped here for 10 years, who'd given up hope of ever seeing her family again. "No," I said, "I'm not giving up, and neither should you." I shook free and headed into the tunnel that felt most wrong, most unnatural. If the spirit was at the center, then the wrongness would get stronger as I got closer. The tunnel sloped downward, and the air got colder with each step. The laurel branches overhead grew thicker, blocking out more and more light. My flashlight beam seemed to bend and twist, like the air itself was distorted. Behind me, I could hear the voices of the lost souls calling out, warnings, begging me to come back. But their voices got fainter as I went deeper. The tunnel split into 4 paths, then 8, then 16. Each split, I chose the path that felt most wrong, most threatening. My skin crawled, my hair stood on end, every instinct told me to turn around and run. But I kept going. The tunnels were getting narrower now, forcing me to crawl in places. Thorns tore at my uniform and skin. The cold was bitter, like winter air, but I could see my breath steaming. That's when I started to hear it. A sound like wind through dry leaves, but there was no wind. It was coming from up ahead, growing louder as I approached. The tunnel opened into a clearing, and I knew I'd found the center. It was huge, maybe 100 yards across, and perfectly circular. The ground was covered in strange symbols burned into the earth, spiraling patterns that hurt to look at. At the very center was a pit filled with blue flames that gave off no heat and no smoke. And around the pit were bones, hundreds of them, arranged in careful patterns. Not animal bones, human bones. The wind-like sound was coming from the fire pit. As I watched, shapes moved in the blue flames. Faces of people I recognized from the missing person reports. They were screaming silently, their mouths open but no sound coming out. That's when I saw it. The spirit rose from the fire pit like smoke taking shape. It was huge, maybe 8 feet tall, and made of shadow and flame. Where its face should have been was just a burning void, but I could feel it watching me. "Another lost soul," it said, and its voice was the sound of forest fires consuming everything in their path. Another meal for the growing darkness. I pulled out my fire kit, my hands shaking so bad I could barely hold the matches. "I'm not lost," I said. "I'm exactly where I need to be." The spirit laughed, and the sound made the laurel branches writhe like snakes. "You cannot destroy what has fed on fear for centuries. I am beyond your small human fire." "Maybe," I said, striking a match. "But I know something about fires that you don't." "And what is that?" I touched the match to my fire paste and tossed it at the nearest laurel thicket. "Sometimes you have to burn everything down to save what matters." The chemical fire caught instantly, racing up the laurel branches, despite their moisture. The spirit shrieked as the flames spread, blue fire turning orange and red. "You fool! You'll destroy yourself." "Maybe," I said, lighting another fire starter and throwing it in a different direction. "But I'll destroy you first." The fire was spreading fast now, jumping from branch to branch. The spirit was getting smaller, weaker, as its domain burned around it, but it wasn't giving up without a fight. The ground began to shake, and the symbols burned into the earth started glowing with that cold blue light. The pit of flames roared, higher, and the bones around it began to move, forming into shapes that looked almost human. "If I die, the lost souls die with me," the spirit screamed. "Their essence is bound to this place." That stopped me cold. If I destroyed the spirit, would I destroy Susan and Robert and all the others too? But then I heard voices through the smoke and flames, the lost souls, calling out to me. "Do it, Ginny. Burn it all. Set us free." They weren't begging me to stop. They were begging me to finish what I'd started. I lit my last fire starter and threw it directly at the spirit. The orange flames met the blue ones with a sound like thunder. The spirit's scream shook the ground. It reached out toward me with hands made of shadow and fire, but it was already fading. "You cannot destroy what has always been." "Watch me," I said. The blue fire went out all at once, like someone had blown out a candle. The spirit collapsed in on itself and vanished. The burning laurel around me was crackling and roaring now, but I wasn't afraid. This was a clean fire, a natural fire. It would burn away the unnatural growth and let the forest heal. Through the smoke, I saw them, the lost souls, but they looked different now. They looked peaceful. They were fading away like mist in the morning sun. Susan Martinez smiled at me as she disappeared. "Thank you," she whispered. One by one, they all faded away, finally free. I ran through the burning laurel, following the flames back toward the surface. The fire had created a clear path, burning away the twisted tunnels and leaving a straight shot to the outside world. When I finally emerged from the laurel hell, my radio crackled to life immediately. "Thornberry, this is dispatch. What's your status?" "We've lost contact for over 8 hours." 8 hours? It had felt like days. "Dispatch, I need fire crews at my location immediately. We have a forest fire, but it's contained." "Repeat, contained fire, but I need crews for cleanup." I sat down on a rock and watched the smoke rising from the laurel hell. The fire would burn for days, but it would burn clean. When it was done, there would be clear ground where the twisted tunnels had been, and maybe, just maybe, no one would ever get lost in there again. The fire crews arrived within an hour, coming up the mountain roads with their trucks and equipment. By then, the fire was already starting to die down on its own. Controlled burns do that when they're done right. They burn hot and fast, then burn themselves out. I told the incident commander that I'd found evidence of an old, illegal campfire that had flared up in the dry conditions. Technically true, if you counted the spirit's blue flames as a campfire. I didn't mention the supernatural stuff. In my report, I wrote it up as a successful controlled burn to clear hazardous undergrowth. The investigators found the backpacks and personal effects from the missing hikers. Officially, the department concluded that the laurel hell had been a death trap for decades, so thick and confusing that people got lost and died of exposure, their remains scattered by animals over the years. They declared the entire area a permanent fire hazard zone and closed it to hikers. Put up signs, built a fence, the whole works. As far as I know, no one has gotten lost in those woods since. But I couldn't stay in Virginia after that. It took 3 months before I could sleep without nightmares. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those blue flames and heard the spirit's voice. Worse, I started having panic attacks in thick woods. The slightest bit of dense vegetation would send me into a cold sweat. I transferred to a ranger station in Nevada, desert country, where you can see for miles in every direction and nothing grows thick enough to get lost in. Wide open spaces, clean air, no shadows deep enough to hide anything. Supernatural. It's been 5 years now, and I'm doing better. The nightmares have mostly stopped, and I can handle my job just fine as long as I stay out of thick forests. But sometimes, when the wind blows through the sagebrush at night, I swear I can still hear them, the voices of the lost souls, calling out across the darkness. Not trapped anymore, but not entirely gone either. Just free. And sometimes I wonder if there are other places like the Laurel Hell, other spirit traps hidden in the deep woods, waiting for people to stumble into them. Other rangers out there dealing with things they can't put in official reports. If you're reading this, and you work in the wilderness, listen to the old stories. Listen to what the local tribes say about certain areas. If they tell you to stay away from a place, there's usually a good reason. And if you ever find yourself in thick woods where the paths don't make sense, where the compass spins wildly, where you hear voices calling from the shadows, get out. Get out fast, and don't look back. Some places in this world are meant to stay empty. Some hungers are better left unfed. Trust me on this one. The Forest Service transferred me to Nevada, like I said. But before I left Virginia, I did one more thing. I went back to where the Laurel Hell used to be. The fire had cleared everything away, leaving just open meadow and young saplings starting to grow. Clean, natural growth. But in the center of the clearing, where the spirit's fire pit had been, nothing grew at all. The ground was still black and barren. I stood there for a while, making sure I didn't feel anything wrong. No cold spots, no strange sounds, no feeling of being watched. Just normal forest, the way it should be. But as I was leaving, I found something that made me stop cold. Carved into a tree at the edge of the clearing were Cherokee symbols, old ones, older than any of the missing hikers. They looked like they'd been there for generations. I couldn't read them, but I knew what they meant. The same thing as the signs the Forest Service had put up. Stay away. Some warnings are worth listening to. I just wish it hadn't taken me 13 years, and almost becoming a lost soul myself, to learn that lesson. The Cherokee knew about the laurel hell long before any of us. They knew how to contain it, how to keep it from growing. But when the old ways were forgotten, when the ceremonies stopped, the spirit trap grew stronger. Maybe that's the real tragedy. Not just the people who got lost, but the knowledge that was lost too. The understanding that some places in this world aren't meant for human beings. I think about that sometimes, out here in the Nevada desert where the sky goes on forever and there's nowhere for shadows to hide. I think about the balance between the human world and the wild world, and what happens when that balance gets broken. And I remember the voices of the lost souls, finally free after decades of wandering. That's what keeps me going on the bad days, knowing that Susan Martinez and Robert Chen and all the others are finally at peace. But I also remember the Spirit's words. You cannot destroy what has always been. Maybe I didn't destroy it. Maybe I just moved it somewhere else. Maybe it's out there right now, looking for a new place to build its maze, to trap new souls. That's the thing about fighting monsters. You never really know if you've won. You just hope you've bought some time, saved some lives, made the world a little bit safer. And you listen to the wind at night, just in case you hear voices calling from the darkness again. Because somewhere out there, in some deep woods where the paths don't make sense, there's always another laurel hell waiting to be found. Just remember what I told you. If you hear voices in the forest, don't follow them. And always, always carry fire. My name is Samuel Blackrock, and I've been a park ranger for 19 years in the Daniel Boone National Forest. Most folks think my job is all about campfires and lost hikers, but the truth is, I spend most of my time keeping people safe underground. See, this part of Kentucky is riddled with old coal mines, and every year some fool thinks they can explore them without knowing what they're walking into. I know mines better than most. My daddy worked the coal for 32 years before a roof collapse took him when I was 16. After that, I swore I'd never go underground again. But life has a funny way of pushing you toward the very thing you're running from. When the Forest Service needed someone who understood mine safety, they came knocking on my door. Now I'm 43, and I've pulled more people out of underground trouble than I care to count. I know how to read gas levels, how to spot unstable timber, how to navigate flooded shafts in the dark. I carry the best equipment money can buy: gas detectors, emergency breathing gear, enough rope to reach the bottom of any mine in these mountains. But I never believed in mine ghosts. Not until December of 1962, when 3 teenagers went missing near the old Blackwater mine. It was the worst winter storm we'd seen in years. Ice covered everything, making the mountain roads nearly impossible to drive. The mine entrance, what was left of it, sat in a hollow so remote that even in good weather it took an hour to hike there from the nearest road. The mine had been sealed after a disaster in 1943, when 23 miners got trapped during a roof collapse. They never found the bodies. The missing kids were from town: Jimmy Morrison, age 17, and the Hartley twins, both 16. Their parents said they'd gone out exploring that morning and never came home. In a blizzard like this, they could freeze to death in hours if they were stuck outside. But if they'd gone into the mine, looking for shelter, that might be even worse. I loaded my truck with gear and started the long, careful drive up the mountain. The wind howled through the trees, and snow came down so hard I could barely see 10 feet ahead. Every few minutes, I had to stop and scrape ice off my windshield. When I finally reached the trailhead, I could see fresh tire tracks in the snow, probably the kid's car. The tracks led to where the old mining road used to be, now just a walking trail that wound up through the trees toward the mine entrance. I strapped on my pack and started hiking. The snow was knee-deep and still falling. My breath came out in white puffs, and the cold bit at my face like tiny needles. But I knew these mountains, and I knew how to move through them, even in weather like this. It took me nearly 2 hours to reach the mine. What I found there made my blood run cold. The kids had definitely been here. Their footprints were clear in the snow around the entrance, or what should have been the entrance. The mine had been sealed with concrete and steel back in 1943, but someone had broken through. The opening was just big enough for a person to squeeze inside. Fresh footprints led straight into the dark. I pulled out my flashlight and gas detector. The device beeped as it warmed up, then settled into a steady green light, safe air, at least near the entrance. I called out into the darkness. "Jimmy, Sarah, Lisa, can you hear me?" My voice echoed back from deep underground, but there was no answer. Just the sound of wind whistling through the mine entrance, and something else. Something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It sounded almost like singing. A low, rhythmic chant, like men working together on a hard job. But that was impossible. This mine had been empty for 20 years. I checked my equipment one more time and squeezed through the broken entrance into the Blackwater mine. The first thing that hit me was the smell. Not the dusty, stale air I expected from an old mine, but something fresher. Almost like the air was moving, being pumped from somewhere deeper underground. My gas detector stayed green, but the readings kept shifting. Carbon dioxide levels that went up and down like someone was breathing nearby. I followed the kids' footprints deeper into the main tunnel. The mine was in better shape than it should have been. The timber supports looked solid, and the floor was clear of the debris I'd expect after 20 years of neglect. Someone had been maintaining this place, but that didn't make sense. The mine company had written it off completely after the disaster. About 100 yards in, I found the first thing that made me stop cold. There was a lunch pail sitting on a wooden crate beside the tunnel wall. It was old, the kind workers carried in the 1940 seconds, but it looked like someone had just set it down. I opened it with my gloved hand. Inside was a sandwich wrapped in wax paper, an apple, and a thermos that was still warm. Still warm. I checked my watch. It was past 4 in the afternoon, and the temperature outside was below freezing. There was no way that thermos should be warm unless someone had filled it recently. But who and why? I called out again, louder this time. "Jimmy, kids, if you're in here, answer me." This time I heard something back. Not voices, but that singing again. It was definitely coming from deeper in the mine, and it was definitely human voices. Men singing together, low and steady, the kind of work song coal miners used to sing to keep time while they dug. But it was impossible. This mine had been empty since 1943. I followed the sound, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness ahead. The tunnel split into 3 branches about 200 yards from the entrance. The kids' footprints went down the middle passage, so I followed them. That's when I started hearing the other sounds, pickaxes hitting stone, the creak and groan of mining equipment, the rumble of coal cars moving on tracks. But every time I stopped to listen closely, the sounds would fade away, leaving just that low singing and the echo of my own breathing. My gas detector was acting strange too. The readings kept jumping between normal and high methane levels, even though I couldn't smell any gas. Methane in a coal mine is deadly. It can explode with just a spark, but the levels I was seeing didn't match what my nose was telling me. I found the first kid about a quarter mile down the middle tunnel. Jimmy Morrison was sitting against the tunnel wall, his eyes wide open, staring straight ahead. He wasn't moving, wasn't blinking, wasn't responding when I called his name. But he was breathing, and when I checked his pulse, it was strong and steady. He was holding a pickaxe in his hands. An old one, the kind they used in the 1940 seconds. The metal was worn smooth from years of use, and the wooden handle was stained dark with what looked like coal dust and sweat. But Jimmy Morrison had never worked in a mine. He was a high school kid from town whose biggest worry was passing algebra. I shook him gently. Jimmy, can you hear me?" He blinked once, slowly, and his eyes focused on me for just a second. His lips moved like he was trying to say something, but all that came out was a low humming sound, the same tune as the singing I'd been hearing. Then his eyes went blank again, and he went back to staring straight ahead. I checked him for injuries, but found nothing. No bumps on his head, no signs of carbon monoxide poisoning, no obvious reason why he should be acting like this. But something was definitely wrong. I needed to get him out of here and find the other 2 kids. I tried to lift Jimmy to his feet, but he wouldn't move. It was like he was glued to that spot, still holding that pickaxe, still humming that tune. When I tried to take the tool away from him, his grip tightened, and for a second, his strength was incredible. Way more than a 17-year-old kid should have. The singing was getting louder now, coming from deeper in the mine. And I could swear I heard new voices joining in, young voices that might have been Sarah and Lisa Hartley. I had to make a choice. Stay with Jimmy and try to get him moving, or go after the twins who might be walking deeper into danger. Jimmy seemed stable for now, even if he was acting strange. The twins might not have much time. I marked the spot with a reflective strip so I could find it again, then headed deeper into the mine, following the sound of that haunting work song. What I found in the next chamber changed everything I thought I knew about the Blackwater mine. The tunnel opened into a large chamber that shouldn't have existed. According to the mine maps I'd studied, this part of the Blackwater should have been solid rock. But here was a room the size of a school gymnasium, with tunnels branching off in all directions, and it was full of activity. Mining equipment was running everywhere. Old-fashioned coal cars moved along rusty tracks, their wheels squeaking and clanking. Conveyor belts carried loads of coal toward some unseen destination. The air was thick with dust and the sound of work. Pickaxes, shovels, men calling instructions to each other, but I couldn't see anyone. The equipment moved by itself. Pickaxes swung through the air, striking stone and coal, but no hands held them. Shovels scooped up loads of coal and dumped them into cars, but no workers guided them. And through it all, that singing continued. Dozens of voices now, maybe more, all joining in the old work songs my daddy used to hum when he came home from his shift. I found the Hartley twins near the center of the chamber. Sarah and Lisa were standing side by side, each holding a mining lamp that burned with a cold blue light. They were singing along with the invisible voices, their young faces blank and peaceful. Like Jimmy, they didn't respond when I called their names. Like Jimmy, they seemed to be under some kind of spell, but unlike Jimmy, they were moving. As I watched, they walked slowly toward one of the side tunnels, following a coal car that moved along its tracks with no one pushing it. Their movements were steady and purposeful, like they knew exactly where they were going. I ran after them, but something stopped me at the tunnel entrance. The air there was different, thicker, colder, and full of a presence I could feel but not see. My gas detector went crazy, beeping and flashing red warnings about dangerous air, but I still couldn't smell any gas. The device was reading something, but I couldn't figure out what. "Sarah, Lisa," I called into the tunnel. "Come back." For just a moment, both girls stopped and turned around. Their eyes focused on me, and I could see fear in them. Real, human fear. Like they were trapped inside their own bodies and couldn't get out. Lisa's mouth moved, and I could barely hear her whisper, "Help us." Then their eyes went blank again, and they disappeared into the darkness of the tunnel. I started to follow them, but a hand grabbed my shoulder. I spun around, flashlight raised, ready to fight. But there was no one there. Just empty air and the continuing sound of work all around me. But I had felt that hand, strong fingers, rough with calluses, gripping me tight enough to leave bruises. Then I heard a voice, clear as day, speaking right next to my ear. "Don't go down there, son. That tunnel ain't safe." The voice was familiar. It took me a moment to place it, but when I did, my blood turned to ice. It was my daddy's voice. The same Kentucky accent, the same tone he used when he was trying to protect me from something dangerous. But my daddy had been dead for 27 years, crushed under 1,000 tons of rock in a mine collapse just like this one. I backed away from the tunnel entrance, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it over the mining sounds. My flashlight beam swept across the chamber, and for just a second, I saw them. Men in mining gear, covered in coal dust, working with pickaxes and shovels. I could see their faces, tired, determined faces of men who'd spent their lives underground. Some of them I recognized from old photographs. They were the miners who died in the 1943 disaster, the ones whose bodies were never recovered. And there, swinging a pickaxe near the far wall, was my daddy. He looked exactly like he had the day he died, 46 years old, wearing his dented hard hat and his lucky work shirt. He was singing along with the others, that same song I'd heard him hum 1,000 times when I was a boy. When he saw me looking at him, he stopped working and walked over. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't think of anything. Except that this was impossible. That dead men don't come back to work the mines they died in. My daddy stopped a few feet away and smiled. The same gentle smile he'd given me when I scraped my knee or had a nightmare. "Hello, Sammy," he said. "I've been waiting for you." "You're dead," I whispered. "You died in 1935. Death ain't the end down here," he said. "This mine takes care of its own. We keep working, keep singing, keep the tunnels safe. And now we're going to take care of these young folks too. Keep them safe from the world above." Behind him, the other miners had stopped working and were gathering around us. I could see them all clearly now, 23 men who'd been trapped here for almost 20 years, still trying to finish the job they'd started before the roof came down. "The children," I said. "What did you do to them?" "Same thing we're going to do for you," my daddy said. "Bring you into the family. Down here, you don't have to worry about storms or accidents or getting old. Down here, you just work and sing and stay safe forever." The miners started moving closer, and I realized I was in more danger than I'd ever been in my life. These weren't ghosts or spirits. They were something else, something that could grab my shoulder and make mining equipment move and trap the minds of 3 teenagers. And they wanted to keep us here forever. I had to get out, had to get the kids out, but first, I had to understand what I was really fighting. "The roof collapse," I said, backing toward the main tunnel. "In 1943, what really happened?" My daddy's expression changed. The gentle smile disappeared, and for a moment, he looked tired and sad and very, very old. "We were trying to dig out," he said. "After the cave-in, we were trapped, but we kept working, kept trying to dig a way to freedom. We worked for days, weeks, months. We never stopped, we never gave up, and eventually we broke through, not to the surface, but to something else, something that let us keep working forever." "But you're dead," I said. "Are we?" he asked. And then he smiled again, but this time it wasn't gentle at all. "Seems to me we're the only ones really alive down here. Everyone else up there, they just waste their time with worry and fear and getting old. Down here, we have purpose, we have each other, we have work to do." The miners were surrounding me now, and I could see that some of them were carrying tools, pickaxes and shovels that looked very sharp and very solid. My daddy stepped closer, reaching out his hand. "Come on, Sammy," he said. "It's time to join the family business." That's when I ran. I ran through the main chamber, dodging mining equipment that seemed to move to block my path. Coal cars rolled across tracks to cut me off. Conveyor belts tried to sweep my feet out from under me, and behind me, I could hear the miners giving chase, their work boots pounding on stone, their voices raised in a song that was no longer gentle but angry and demanding. I made it to the tunnel where I'd left Jimmy Morrison, but he was gone, just the pickaxe lying on the ground where he'd been sitting, and a set of footprints leading deeper into the mine. My flashlight was starting to dim, and my gas detector had given up completely, just flashing random warnings that didn't match anything in the air around me. I was alone in a mine full of dead men who wanted to make me one of them, and I had no idea how to fight something that was already dead. But I had to try. Those kids were depending on me. I followed Jimmy's footprints deeper into the mine, past chambers I'd never seen on any map, through tunnels that twisted and turned like they'd been dug by something that didn't understand human engineering. The singing was everywhere now, echoing off the walls, coming from ahead and behind and all around me. I found all 3 kids in the deepest part of the mine I'd seen yet. They were standing in a circle around what looked like a shrine made of mining equipment. Pickaxes, shovels, hard hats, and lunch pails were arranged in careful patterns around a central point where water dripped steadily from the ceiling into a dark pool. The kids were singing along with the invisible voices, and their eyes were completely black now, not just the pupils, but the whole eye, like they were looking at something far away. And surrounding them were the miners. I could see all 23 of them clearly now, plus my daddy standing near the back of the group. They looked solid, real, like living men covered in coal dust. But there was something wrong with their faces, expressions that were too intense, eyes that reflected my flashlight beam like an animal's. "Welcome, son," said a man I recognized from the memorial photo as the mine foreman, Joe Hartwell. "We've been waiting for you to join the family." "Let the kids go," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "They don't belong here." Nobody belongs on the surface, Hartwell said. Up there, people just suffer and die. Down here, we take care of each other. These young folks understand that now. They want to stay. They're children, I said. They have families who love them. And we love them too, my daddy said, stepping forward, more than anyone on the surface ever could. We'll keep them safe forever, Sammy, just like we want to keep you safe. I looked at the kids again. Jimmy Morrison was 16 years old, too young to spend eternity swinging a pickaxe. The Hartley twins had just gotten their driver's licenses. They had whole lives ahead of them, dreams and plans and people who cared about them. This isn't safety, I said. This is a prison. The miners' faces changed. The false kindness disappeared, and I could see what they really were. Desperate, terrified men who'd been trapped underground for 20 years and had lost their minds in the darkness. You don't understand, Hartwell said, and his voice was getting louder, angrier. We died trying to get out. We dug and dug until our hands bled and our bodies gave out. But we kept going. We broke through to something beyond death, something that let us keep working, keep existing, and now we can share that gift with others. It's not a gift, I said. It's madness. Maybe, my daddy said, and now he was holding a pickaxe too. But it's better than what's waiting up there, better than growing old and weak and dying alone. The miners started moving closer, and I realized talking wasn't going to work. These men, or whatever they'd become, truly believed they were saving us. In their minds, trapping us in the mine forever was an act of love. But I had one more card to play. I started to sing, not one of their work songs, but something my daddy had taught me when I was small. A song about miners who died in a collapse, about the families they'd left behind, about the pain of being separated from the people you love. It was a sad song, a song about loss and grief and the terrible price of working underground. The effect was immediate. The miners stopped moving, stopped threatening, stopped everything. They just stood there listening, and I could see remembering in their faces, remembering what it felt like to be human, to love people, to miss the sunlight and the sound of children playing. My daddy started to cry. I miss her, he whispered. I miss your mother. I miss watching you grow up. I miss everything. Then let us go, I said gently. Let these kids go back to their families. Let them have the lives you never got to finish. For a moment, I thought it was going to work. The miners looked uncertain, conflicted. Some of them were nodding, like they were remembering something important. But then Hartwell shook his head violently. No, he shouted. We can't let them. Leave. If they go back up there, they'll forget us. They'll leave us alone down here forever. The spell broke. The miners surged forward, and I knew I had only seconds before they reached me. I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed my emergency flare gun from my belt and fired it straight at the ceiling above the shrine. The flare exploded against the stone roof in a shower of red sparks and burning magnesium. And in that brilliant light, I could see the truth. The miners weren't solid at all. They were made of shadow and coal dust and 20 years of accumulated despair. The mine equipment that had been moving by itself was rusted and broken. The tunnels that seemed so well maintained were full of debris and standing water. But most importantly, I could see that the kids were standing on the edge of a deep pit, the same pit where the 23 miners had fallen to their deaths in 1943. One more step and they would have joined them forever. The flare burned for 30 seconds, and in that light, the truth became clear. The miners weren't trying to save us. They were trying to make us share their fate. The shrine was built around the collapsed shaft where they'd died, and they wanted company in their eternal prison. But the light also showed me something else. A way out. I grabbed Jimmy Morrison first, pulling him away from the edge of the pit. The pickaxe fell from his hands, and his eyes cleared immediately. He looked around in confusion and terror. Where are we? He gasped. How did we get here? No time to explain, I said, dragging him toward Sarah Hartley. Help me get your friends. Together, we pulled the twins away from the pit. The spell that had held them broke as soon as they stepped away from the shrine, and they collapsed, shaking and crying but alive and human again. The miners were screaming now, not in anger, but in despair. They could see their prisoners escaping, could feel their desperate loneliness returning. But they couldn't follow us into the light of the flare. They were bound to the darkness, to the pit where they'd died, to the endless work that kept them from facing what they'd really become. My daddy was the last one I saw before the flare burned out. "I'm sorry, Sammy," he said, and his voice was full of pain and regret. "I just wanted to see you again." "I know, Daddy," I whispered. "I love you too. But this isn't the way." Then the light died, and we were alone in the dark with 4 flashlights and a desperate need to get out of that mine before the singers realized we were gone. Getting the kids to the surface was the hardest thing I've ever done. They were weak and confused, and the mine seemed to fight us every step of the way. Tunnels that had been clear on the way in were suddenly blocked with debris. Passages that led straight out seemed to curve back on themselves. It was like the mine itself was trying to keep us, but we made it. Just as my flashlight finally died completely, I saw gray light ahead, the entrance, and the winter storm that was still raging outside. It was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. I radioed for medical help as soon as we reached my truck. The kids were taken to the hospital, where doctors found nothing wrong with them except exhaustion and mild hypothermia. They had no memory of what happened in the mine after the first few minutes. As far as they knew, they'd gotten lost in the dark, and I'd found them wandering near the entrance. That was fine with me. The mine entrance was sealed again the next week, this time with steel plates and concrete barriers that would take dynamite to break through. I recommended that the entire area be posted as a hazardous zone, and my superiors agreed without question. They trusted my expertise about mine safety. If only they knew the real reason I wanted that place locked up forever. I transferred to Surface Patrol the following month. Told my supervisor that I was getting too old to crawl around in underground spaces, that I wanted to focus on trail maintenance and wilderness rescue. He understood. After 19 years of mine work, most rangers would want to change. But the truth is, I can't go underground anymore. Every time I try, I hear the singing. Those old work songs echoing through the darkness, calling me home to a family that's been waiting in the deep places for almost 30 years now. Sometimes, on quiet nights when I'm patrolling the back country, I can hear them even on the surface. Faint voices carried on the wind, singing about the work that never ends, about the family that's always waiting, about the safety that can be found in the dark places beneath the earth. The Blackwater mine is sealed now, but there are dozens of other abandoned mines in these mountains. Places where men died in cave-ins and explosions and floods, where bodies were never recovered, where the work was never finished. I carry extra flares now when I patrol near those places. Light seems to be the only thing that keeps the singers at bay. If you ever find yourself hiking in the old mining country of eastern Kentucky, listen carefully when you're near the abandoned shafts and sealed entrances. If you hear work songs echoing from underground, if you see fresh footprints leading into the dark, if you feel the urge to squeeze through broken barriers and explore the tunnels below, don't. Just don't. Some families aren't worth joining, and some work is too dangerous to finish. The miners are still down there, still singing, still waiting for new members to join their eternal crew. And they're very, very patient. They've got all the time in the world. My name is Margaret Ironwood, and for 15 years I've been tracking everything from black bears to bootleggers through these Tennessee mountains. Cherokee National Forest is my beat. 30,000 acres of ridges so steep they'll break your neck if you're not careful, and so remote that some trails don't appear on any map the government will admit to having. People call me Maggie. I'm 36, built like my grandmother was, short, strong, and stubborn as mountain stone. My great-grandmother was full Cherokee, which means something out here where the old paths still remember who walked them first. It also means I grew up hearing stories most park rangers never learn in their training. The Smoky Mountains have their own rules. You learn that fast or you don't last. I can track a wounded deer through a thunderstorm, identify animal scat in complete darkness, and find my way off any ridge in this forest blindfolded. What I couldn't do, until this spring, was explain why perfectly experienced hikers kept reporting helpful strangers who appeared out of nowhere and then vanished without a trace. It started in March of 1973. The weather had been strange all month. Unseasonable fog rolling up from the valleys, temperature inversions that turned the high ridges into cloud forests where you couldn't see 10 feet in any direction. The kind of weather that makes even experienced hikers nervous. The first report came from a couple from Knoxville. They'd been hiking the Appalachian Trail section that runs along the Tennessee-North Carolina border when fog rolled in so thick they couldn't find the trail markers. They were getting scared, thinking they'd have to spend the night exposed on the ridge, when an old Cherokee man appeared out of the mist. He was dressed like something from a museum, the woman told me. Beautiful traditional clothes, beadwork that looked ancient. He spoke perfect English, very polite. He knew exactly where we were and led us right to the shelter at Klingman's Dome. When we turned to thank him, he was gone. I wrote it up as a cultural liaison volunteer. We had several Cherokee folks who helped out with trail maintenance and visitor education, though none of them had mentioned working that area. But people get confused in fog. Details get mixed up. The second report came a week later. This time, it was a group of college students from Georgia Tech. They'd taken a wrong turn somewhere past Charlie's Bunyan and ended up on an unmarked trail that seemed to lead straight down the mountain. They were arguing about whether to continue or backtrack when a Cherokee woman in traditional dress appeared. She looked maybe 40, maybe 20. It was hard to tell, one of the students said. She pointed us toward a trail we hadn't seen before. Said it would take us back to the main path in about a mile. She was right, but when we looked back, she was gone. Just gone. I hiked out to check the area, they described. Found the trail they'd taken. It was an old Cherokee footpath that appeared on some maps from the 1800s but hadn't been maintained in decades. Somehow, though, it was in perfect condition. No fallen trees, no overgrowth. The stones along the path had been recently reset, fitted so perfectly you couldn't slide a knife blade between them. That bothered me more than I wanted to admit. The third report made me stop sleeping well at night. A solo hiker named David Park, a geologist from Virginia who'd been hiking these mountains for 20 years, swore he'd been saved from a 1,000-foot fall by a Cherokee family that couldn't possibly have existed. He'd been hiking the knife-edge section of the Sawteeth Ridge when the fog rolled in. The trail there is barely 3 feet wide with drops on both sides that'll kill you just as dead whether you fall left or right. Park had been feeling his way along the ridge when he stepped on loose rock and started sliding toward the north drop. I was gone, he told me, his hands shaking as he lit another cigarette. Nothing but air under me. Then these hands grabbed my jacket and pulled me back up. A Cherokee man, woman, and 2 kids, dressed like they were heading to a powwow or something. The man said something to me in Cherokee that I didn't understand, then pointed toward a path I swear wasn't there 5 minutes earlier. Park followed the path. It led him safely off the ridge and connected to a Forest Service trail near Gatlinburg. When he turned to thank the family, the fog had cleared, and he was alone on a section of mountain where the Cherokee path simply didn't exist anymore. I requested the duty roster for all our Cherokee volunteers. None of them had been in that area. I checked with the Cherokee Nation Cultural Office in North Carolina. No sanctioned activities on the ridge that week. That's when I decided I needed to see for myself what was happening up there. I should have listened to my grandmother's stories more carefully. I packed 3 days of supplies and headed up to Sawteeth Ridge on a Tuesday morning in late March. The weather forecast called for clear skies, but by the time I reached the tree line, fog was already creeping up from the valleys like something alive. My radio crackled with the morning check-in from the other rangers. Tom's voice from the Elkmont station was crystal clear, but underneath it I heard something that made me stop walking. Voices speaking Cherokee. Soft, but distinct. Old Cherokee, the formal kind my great-grandmother used for ceremonies. I keyed my radio. Tom, you getting some interference on your signal? Negative, Maggie, you're coming through fine. What kind of interference? The Cherokee voices had stopped. Never mind. Probably just atmospheric distortion from the fog. But I knew it wasn't. The Sawteeth Ridge Trail starts easy enough, following an old logging road for the first 2 miles. Then it climbs steep switchbacks for another mile before hitting the knife-edge section where David Park had his encounter. The whole ridge runs about 5 miles, with 3 peaks that earned the name because they're sharp enough to cut you if you're not careful. I'd hiked this trail maybe 50 times in 15 years. I knew every route, every rock, every place where the trail narrowed or the footing got tricky. What I didn't know was why there were new stone markers every quarter mile along the path. They weren't Forest Service markers. They were flat river stones, each about the size of a dinner plate, stacked in careful piles of 3. Cherokee trail markers, the kind my great-grandmother had described from the old days, but these were fresh. The moss hadn't had time to grow on them, and they were positioned with the kind of precision that takes real skill. I stopped at the 3rd marker and examined it carefully. The stones were local river rock, but they'd been shaped, somehow, fitted together so perfectly they looked like they'd grown that way. No tool marks, no chisel scratches, just smooth, perfect surfaces that seemed to lock together naturally. The fog was getting thicker. By the time I reached the knife-edge section, I couldn't see more than 5 feet in any direction. This was where I should have turned back. Standard safety protocol says you don't hike dangerous terrain in 0 visibility. But I was a ranger with 15 years of experience, and I had a job to do. I clipped my safety line to the guide wire that runs along the worst section of the ridge and started forward, feeling for each step. The wind was completely still, which was wrong. There's always wind on the ridges, especially in weather like this. The silence was so complete I could hear my heartbeat echoing off the rocks. That's when I heard the drumming. Low, rhythmic, like a heartbeat made of thunder. It seemed to come from the valleys on both sides of the ridge, but that was impossible. Sound carries strange in fog, but this was different. This was drumming that I felt in my bones before I heard it with my ears. I stopped and listened. The drumming continued for maybe 30 seconds, then faded away. In the silence that followed, I heard footsteps on the trail ahead of me. Multiple people, walking at a steady pace, their feet finding secure footing where I was struggling to place each step. The footsteps were getting closer. I called out, "Hello? This is Park Service. Can you hear me?" The footsteps stopped. "I'm a ranger." I called again. "The trail's dangerous in this fog. I need to help you get to safety." A voice answered from about 10 feet away, speaking Cherokee. An old man's voice, formal and patient. I couldn't understand all the words, but the tone was clear. He was asking if I needed help. "English," I said. "Do you speak English?" "Yes," the voice said, switching languages smoothly. "You are the granddaughter of Martha Ironwood." My great-grandmother's name. Nobody had called her that in 20 years. "How do you know that name?" "She walked these paths with respect, as do you. The ridge is dangerous today. You should not travel alone." Through the fog, I saw the outline of a man. Tall, wearing what looked like traditional Cherokee clothing, buckskin jacket, geometric beadwork across the chest. His face was kind but ageless in the way that some Cherokee elders have, as if they've seen enough years that counting stopped mattering. "I'm a ranger," I said. "This is my job." "Are you with the cultural education program?" He smiled, and something about that smile made my skin crawl. Not because it was threatening, because it was too knowing, too understanding, like he could see straight through to thoughts I hadn't had yet. "I am with the people who have always walked these ridges," he said. "Come. The path is treacherous ahead. There is a safer way." He turned and started walking, not along the main trail, but toward what looked like solid rock. As I watched, fog swirled away from the mountain face, and I saw a narrow path carved into the stone, a path that definitely hadn't been there when I'd hiked this ridge 2 weeks ago. Every rational part of my mind said to clip back onto the main trail and head for safety. But 15 years of ranger training said you don't leave people alone on dangerous mountains, and my Cherokee blood said you listen when the elders offer guidance. I followed him into the fog. The path he led me on was impossible. It curved around cliff faces that should have been impassable, crossed gaps that seemed too wide to jump but somehow weren't, and wound through areas where the rock had been worn smooth by countless footsteps over centuries. We walked in silence for what felt like an hour. The fog began to thin as we climbed, and I started to see more clearly. The path we were on was beautiful, ancient stonework that flowed with the natural contours of the mountain, reinforced with fitted stones that looked like they'd been placed by master craftsmen. "This trail isn't on any map," I said. "Maps change," he replied. "Paths remain." When we reached the other side of the ridge, the fog cleared completely. I found myself standing at a familiar trail junction near the 3rd peak of the Sawteeth. A perfectly normal Forest Service trail that I'd hiked dozens of times. I turned to thank the old man, but he was gone. Not just out of sight, gone. The path we'd taken was gone too. There was nothing behind me but a sheer rock face that would take climbing gear to approach, and I was standing on solid ground with no memory of how I'd gotten there. My radio crackled to life. Tom's voice, concerned. "Maggie, you missed your afternoon check-in. Everything okay up there?" I looked at my watch. It was 4:30 p.m. I'd started following the old man at noon. 4.5 hours were missing from my day. "Yeah, Tom," I said, my voice shakier than I wanted it to be. "Just some navigation issues in the fog. Heading back now." But as I started down the mountain, I could feel eyes watching me from the ridges above. And when the wind shifted, I swear I could smell wood smoke from fires that weren't there. I didn't file a report about the old man. What was I going to write? Encountered helpful Cherokee spirit who led me through impossible terrain? Instead, I requested the maintenance logs for the Sawteeth Ridge. Someone was doing unauthorized trail work up there, and I was going to find out who. The logs showed nothing. No scheduled maintenance, no permit requests, no reports of volunteer activities. But when I cross-referenced the dates of the hiker encounters with weather reports and ranger duty rosters, a pattern emerged. Every encounter happened during fog conditions. Every encounter involved Cherokee people in traditional dress. And every encounter took place near sites that appeared on 19th century Cherokee trail maps, but not on modern Forest Service surveys. I called Janet Crowfeather, our liaison with the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. Janet had grown up on the Qualla boundary and knew the old stories better than anyone. "Maggie," she said when I described what I'd found, "you need to be very careful up there." Careful of what? Unauthorized trail maintenance? Careful of the Nunahee. The word sent chills down my spine. My great-grandmother had told me stories about the Nunahee when I was little. The spirit people. Cherokee ancestors who had chosen to stay and guard the sacred places rather than cross over to the Nightland. "Janet, I need facts, not folklore." "Facts?" Her voice got serious. "Fact, those trail markers you described match descriptions of ancient Cherokee boundary stones. Fact, the stonework techniques you're seeing were lost when the Cherokee were forced out in 1838. Fact, my grandmother warned me never to hike those ridges alone during fog season. And why is that? Because sometimes the Nunahee invite travelers to stay with them. And sometimes those travelers never find their way back to our world." I thanked Janet and hung up, but her words stayed with me. That night, I dreamed about walking endless stone paths through mountains that stretched beyond the horizon, while drums echoed from valleys full of mist and starlight. 3 days later, I got a call that changed everything. A family of 4 from Atlanta, parents and 2 teenage kids, had been hiking the northern section of the Sawteeth Ridge when they encountered what they described as a Cherokee village that shouldn't exist. The Dai, father, a software engineer named Mike Chen, was the kind of man who dealt in facts and logic. When he called the ranger station, his voice was shaking. "We were hiking toward Charlie's Bunyan when the fog rolled in," he said. "We took shelter under some rocks to wait it out. When it cleared, we were looking down into a valley that's not on any map. There was a village down there. Traditional Cherokee houses, people in buckskin and feathers, cook fires burning. We could hear children laughing." "Probably a historical reenactment," I said, though I knew it wasn't. "At 8,000 feet elevation, in the middle of nowhere?" And when we tried to hike down to ask for directions, the path kept changing. We'd walk for 10 minutes toward the village, then somehow we'd be back where we started. The family had eventually found their way back to the main trail, but Mike Chen's description of the village was too detailed to dismiss. Stone houses with grass roofs, elaborate totem poles, children playing with wooden toys that looked hand-carved, and everyone in the village wearing traditional clothing that looked ancient but perfectly preserved. I decided to investigate, but this time I wasn't going alone. Sarah Martinez was our newest ranger, fresh out of training and eager to prove herself. She was smart, observant, and completely skeptical of anything that couldn't be explained by standard park protocols. Perfect witness material. We headed up to the northern ridge section on a Thursday morning. The weather was clear when we started, but by noon, fog was creeping up from the valleys just like it had during every other incident. "This is getting predictable," Sarah said, checking her GPS. "Same weather pattern every time." "Yeah," I said. "Too predictable." We reached the area where the Chen family had taken shelter. Nothing unusual, just a standard rock outcropping that hikers used for rest breaks. But when the fog thickened and Sarah went to check her GPS, she got the first sign that we weren't dealing with normal circumstances. "That's weird," she said, tapping the device. "I'm showing our position as about 5 miles southeast of where we actually are. And according to Dumai, we're at sea level." I checked my GPS. Same reading. According to our satellites, we were standing in the middle of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park Visitor Center parking lot. That's when we heard the voices. Singing, this time. Cherokee songs that I half remembered from childhood ceremonies my great-grandmother had taken me to. Multiple voices, harmonizing in the ancient style that makes your soul ache with longing for something you can't name. "Do you hear that?" Sarah asked. "Yeah. You?" Traditional Cherokee music, but there's no performance scheduled for this area. The singing was coming from below us, down in the valley that wasn't supposed to exist. As the fog shifted, we caught glimpses of what Mike Chen had described. Smoke rising from cook fires, the geometric patterns of traditional Cherokee buildings, people moving between the houses, going about daily life that looked like it belonged in a museum diorama. "We need to investigate," Sarah said, starting toward a path that led down into the valley. I grabbed her arm. "No, we document what we can see from here, then we report back. Maggie, this could be the discovery of the century. A preserved Cherokee settlement that's been hidden for over 100 years. Or it could be something that doesn't want to be discovered." But Sarah was already moving down the path, her camera out, taking pictures. I had no choice but to follow. The path was perfect, too perfect. Smooth stone steps that looked like they'd been carved yesterday, handholds positioned exactly where you needed them, wooden bridges over streams that ran crystal clear and sang like music as they flowed. We walked for 20 minutes. And the village got closer but never seemed to get any larger. It was like trying to approach something in a dream, always just out of reach, always exactly the same distance away. Then Sarah stopped walking. "Maggie," she said, her voice strange and distant. "Look at my pictures." She held out her camera's display screen. The photos she'd been taking showed nothing but empty forest. No village, no smoke, no people, just trees and mist and ordinary mountain terrain. "That's impossible," I said. "I can see the village right now. So can I. But the camera sees something different." That's when I looked around and realized we were lost. The path we'd been following had vanished. We were standing in the middle of thick forest with no trail in any direction. The village was still visible below us, but now it seemed farther away than when we'd started walking toward it. My radio crackled with static, then cleared enough for a voice to come through. But it wasn't dispatch. It was an old woman speaking Cherokee, her voice formal and urgent. Sarah looked at me with fear in her eyes for the first time since we'd started hiking together. "Maggie, what did she say?" I understood more Cherokee than I usually admitted. The old woman was giving us a warning. "Turn back now, or stay forever." She said we need to head back to the main trail. I lied. It took us 3 hours to find our way out. 3 hours of walking in circles, following paths that led nowhere, climbing over fallen trees that shouldn't have been there, and through thick undergrowth in areas that had been clear trail just minutes before. When we finally reached the main trail, the fog lifted completely. Behind us, the forest looked perfectly normal. No hidden paths, no village in the valley below, no sign that anything unusual had ever existed. But in my pocket, my digital camera held one photo that shouldn't have been possible. A picture of Sarah and me walking down a stone path toward a Cherokee village, full of people in traditional dress, all of them looking directly at the camera with expressions that seemed to say, "Welcome home," a photo that Sarah's camera had refused to take. I took a week of personal leave after the incident with Sarah. Officially, I needed to process some family business. Unofficially, I needed to talk to someone who might understand what was happening on the ridges. My great-aunt Rose lived on the Qualla boundary, in a small house that had belonged to our family for 4 generations. She was 83 years old and sharp as a knife edge, with eyes that seemed to see more than most people were comfortable with. "I've been waiting for you to come," she said when I knocked on her door. "The mountain spirits have been talking about you." Rose made tea and listened while I told her everything that had happened on the Sawteeth Ridge. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. Your great-grandmother used to walk with them, she said finally. The Nunehi. They trusted her because she understood the old ways and honored the mountain places. But she always came back to this world. What are they? Really? Cherokee people who chose to stay when the soldiers came to take us west. They became something between human and spirit, guardians of the sacred places. They help travelers sometimes, but they also test them. Test them for what? Rose looked at me with those two knowing eyes. To see if they're worthy to join them. To see if they love the mountains enough to leave everything else behind. She told me stories I'd never heard. Cherokee families who had hidden in the deepest mountains during the removal, slowly transforming into something other than human. Travelers who had been invited to stay in the spirit villages and chose never to return. Rangers and hikers who had vanished over the years, their bodies never found. Why are they active now? I asked. The mountains are threatened, Rose said. Development. Pollution. Too many people who don't understand what they're walking on. The Nunnehi are choosing new guardians. And they want me. They want someone who understands both worlds. Someone who can protect the sacred places from those who would harm them. That night, I made my decision. I was going back to the Sawtooth Ridge, alone, to confront whatever was happening there. But first, I left a sealed letter with Rose, with instructions to give it to the Forest Service if I didn't return within 3 days. I started hiking before dawn on a Saturday morning. No fog this time, clear skies and perfect visibility. I wanted to see everything clearly when it happened. I reached the knife edge section by noon and stopped to eat lunch. The stone trail markers were still there, but now there were more of them. They formed a clear path leading off the main trail and up toward the highest peak of the Sawtooth. I followed them. The path wound through terrain I'd never seen before, even after 15 years of hiking these mountains. Ancient trees that seemed too big for the elevation. Clearings carpeted with wildflowers that shouldn't bloom until late summer. Streams that ran uphill towards springs that bubbled up from solid rock. At the top of the peak, I found them waiting for me. Dozens of Cherokee people in traditional dress, standing in a circle around a fire that burned without wood. Men, women, children, elders, all of them with that same ageless quality I'd seen in the old man who had guided me through the fog. In the center of the circle stood a woman who looked exactly like my great-grandmother, but younger. She wore a dress of white buckskin, decorated with intricate beadwork, and her hair was braided with feathers and silver ornaments. Margaret Ironwood, she said, her voice carrying clearly despite the wind that had started to howl around the peak. Granddaughter of Martha, great-granddaughter of Sarah, we have been waiting for you. Your Nunehi, I said. We are the people who stayed, the people who chose the mountains over the world below. We have watched you walk our paths with respect, and we have tested your worthiness. Around the circle, the other figures nodded in unison. Children smiled at me with ancient eyes. Elders hummed songs that seemed older than memory. We offer you a choice, the woman continued. Stay with us and help guard these sacred places forever. Become one of us and never know hunger or cold or loneliness again. Walk the mountain paths between worlds and help protect what remains of the old ways. As she spoke, the circle began to change. The traditional clothing dissolved into mist and reformed as familiar ranger uniforms. The Cherokee faces shifted to show people I recognized. Hikers who had vanished over the years, park workers who had disappeared during routine patrols, visitors who had never made it back to their cars. All of them smiling, all of them looking peaceful and content. Or, the woman said, return to your world and forget you ever saw us. Go back to your ranger duties and your paperwork and your radio calls. Grow old and tired and watch as the mountains are slowly destroyed by those who see them as nothing more than a playground. The choice was real. I could feel it in my bones. Stay and become a guardian spirit, or leave and pretend none of this had happened. I thought about my great-grandmother's stories, about the responsibility of protecting sacred places, about 15 years of watching the mountains get more crowded and more damaged every year. But I also thought about the hikers who trusted rangers to bring them home safely, about Sarah Martinez and the other young rangers who needed experienced guides, about the Cherokee kids on the reservation who needed someone to teach them about their heritage in ways they could understand and carry back to the modern world. I can't stay, I said finally. But I can help you from my world. I can protect the sacred places as a ranger and teach others to respect them." The woman smiled, and for a moment she looked exactly like my great-grandmother at the age I'd known her. "We hoped you would choose this path," she said. "You are more valuable to us in your world than in ours." But the choice had to be yours to make. The circle began to fade, becoming translucent in the afternoon sunlight. But before they disappeared completely, the woman stepped forward and pressed something into my hand. A small stone, smooth and warm, carved with symbols I didn't recognize but somehow understood. "When the mountains are in danger," she said, "hold this and call to us. We will hear you." Then they were gone, and I was alone on the peak with nothing but wind and sunlight and the vast expanse of the Cherokee National Forest spreading out below me. I hiked back down the mountain as the sun was setting, following normal trails that led to familiar parking areas. My truck was where I'd left it. My radio worked perfectly. When I checked in with dispatch, they told me I'd been gone exactly 8 hours, a normal day hike for the distance I'd covered. But the stone in my pocket was warm to the touch, and when I looked back up at the Sawtooth Ridge, I could see lights flickering near the peaks. Not electric lights, firelight. I filed my report as a routine patrol. No incidents, no maintenance issues, no visitor contacts, standard paperwork for a standard day. But things changed after that. Hikers still reported encounters with helpful Cherokee people, but the encounters were different now. Less mysterious, more educational. The spirits, I could call them that now, seemed content to offer assistance when needed and share knowledge about Cherokee history and mountain ecology. No more invitations to join them. No more people vanishing. I started carrying small offerings when I hiked the high ridges. Tobacco, which my great-grandmother had taught me was proper, and sometimes wild honey or cornmeal. I'd leave them at the stone trail markers, and they were always gone when I returned. The unauthorized trail maintenance continued, but I stopped trying to figure out who was doing it. Dangerous sections would be repaired overnight. Trail markers would appear exactly where they were needed. Lost hikers would find their way to safety guided by people who vanished as soon as help arrived. I briefed Sarah and the other rangers on Cherokee cultural protocols for the high country. Respect the stone markers. Don't hike alone during fog conditions. If you encounter people in traditional dress, treat them with the same courtesy you'd show any visitor. And always remember that these mountains were home to the Cherokee for thousands of years before they became a national forest. 3 years later, I was promoted to senior ranger for the Cherokee National Forest. My first official act was to establish new protocols for cultural site protection and to hire Janet Crowfeather as our permanent Cherokee cultural liaison. My second act was to designate the Sawtooth Ridge area as culturally sensitive terrain, requiring special permits for research activities. Officially, this was to protect potential archaeological sites. Unofficially, it was to keep amateur ghost hunters and paranormal investigators from bothering the Nunahi. Some nights, when I'm doing paperwork in my office, I can hear drums echoing from the high ridges. Cherokee songs carried on wind that doesn't touch the valleys. The sound of ancient people going about their eternal business of protecting what they love. The stone the spirit woman gave me sits on my desk, disguised as a paperweight. It's warm when the mountains are at peace, cool when they're threatened. Twice, I've had to use it. Once when developers tried to build a resort on sacred ground. Once when a logging company applied for permits near a Cherokee burial site. Both times, I held the stone and whispered a request for help. Both times, the threats disappeared. Legal complications, permit, denials, environmental challenges that couldn't be overcome. The mountains have their own ways of protecting themselves. I still hike the Sawtooth Ridge regularly. Not as often as I used to, but often enough. Sometimes I catch glimpses of the spirit village in the valley below, but I don't try to approach it anymore. Sometimes I hear my name being called by voices that sound like family, but I don't follow them. I made my choice, and I keep it every day. I protect these mountains from my world, the way my ancestors protect them from theirs. But on quiet nights, when fog fills the valleys and the drums echo from the high places, I remember the peace I saw in their faces, the contentment of people who chose love over safety, duty over comfort, forever over the brief span of ordinary human life. And sometimes, just sometimes, I understand why so many people choose to stay. The ridge walkers are still out there. If you hike the Cherokee National Forest, especially the high country near the Tennessee-North Carolina border, you might meet them. They're helpful folks, knowledgeable about the trails and generous with directions. Just remember, they're not really offering you a trail map. They're offering you a choice. Choose carefully. My name is Joshua Deepwater, and I've been a ranger in Jefferson National Forest for 12 years now. Before that, I spent 6 years as a state trooper down in Richmond, but city life burned me out. Too much noise, too many people, too much ugliness. When the ranger position opened up in the Blue Ridge Mountains, I jumped at it. People think being a forest ranger is all about campfire permits and lost hikers. Truth is, I'm federal law enforcement. I carry a gun, make arrests, and investigate crimes that happen in these mountains. In 12 years, I've busted over 200 people for everything from poaching to running illegal stills to growing marijuana in hidden clearings. I know these mountains better than most folks know their own neighborhoods. I'm 34 years old, and I've seen enough strange things in the backwoods to know that mountains keep secrets. But I never believed in hidden mountain people until I found their hollow. It started in October 1986, early, in the month when the leaves were just beginning to turn. I was sitting in my office at the ranger station when old Pete Morrison shuffled in. Pete lived in a cabin about 20 miles up the mountain, and he'd been in these parts longer than anyone could remember. "Ranger Deepwater," he said, taking off his worn baseball cap. "I got something to report." I looked up from my paperwork. "What's on your mind, Pete?" "Smoke," he said. "Been seeing smoke rising from Kettle Hollow for 3 days now." I frowned. Kettle Hollow was marked on our maps as uninhabited wilderness. It was a narrow valley tucked between two ridges, so hidden you could walk within 100 yards of it and never know it was there. No roads led to it, no trails even. Just thick forest and steep slopes. "You sure it was smoke?" I asked. Pete nodded. "Wood smoke, the kind that comes from a chimney, not a wildfire. Someone's living in there, Ranger. And they ain't supposed to be." I made a note in my logbook. Illegal camping was common enough, though most folks didn't venture into places as remote as Kettle Hollow. Still, it was my job to check it out. "I'll take a look," I told Pete. "Thanks for reporting it." After Pete left, I studied the topographic maps. Kettle Hollow was about 25 miles from the nearest settlement, accessible only by foot through some of the roughest country in the forest. The hollow itself was maybe half a mile long and a few hundred yards wide at its widest point. According to the maps, it had been surveyed back in the 1920s and found to contain nothing but wildlife. I decided to hike in the next morning. October nights were getting cold, and whoever was camping in there illegally needed to be moved out before winter set in proper. The hike took me 4 hours through thick woods and over 2 ridges. I know these mountains well, but even I had trouble finding the way down into the hollow. The slopes were steep and covered with loose rock and fallen trees. By the time I worked my way down to the valley floor, it was past noon. What I found there made me stop dead in my tracks. There was a cabin in a small clearing, and it wasn't some makeshift shelter thrown together by campers. This was a real log cabin with a stone chimney, glass windows, and a wooden shingle roof. Smoke was rising from the chimney, just like Pete had said. But that wasn't what puzzled me most. The cabin looked old, really old. The logs were weathered to a silver-gray color that takes decades to develop. The chinking between the logs was done with clay and moss in a style I'd only seen in historical sites. Even stranger, there was a garden beside the cabin with late vegetables still growing. Turnips, winter squash, and kale that looked healthy and well-tended. I walked closer, my hand resting on my radio. The garden really bothered me. The soil in this hollow should have been acidic mountain dirt, poor for growing anything. But these vegetables were thriving like they were planted in rich farmland. That's when I noticed my radio wasn't crackling with static like it usually did in remote areas. It was completely silent. I tried to raise the base station, but got nothing. Not even static, just dead air. I approached the cabin slowly, my training kicking in. The windows had curtains, but I couldn't see anyone moving inside. A pile of split firewood was stacked neatly beside the front door. An axe leaned against the wall, its blade sharp and clean. "Hello," I called out. "Forest Service." No answer. I walked around the cabin, looking for signs of how many people might be living here. There were no vehicles, of course, no way to get one down into this hollow, no power lines either. But there was a well with a hand pump, and clothes hanging on a line behind the cabin. The clothes stopped me cold. There were dresses that looked like something from an old Western movie, long, plain, made of heavy fabric. Men's shirts and pants that seemed handmade. Even the way they were hung on the line looked old-fashioned, with wooden clothespins instead of the plastic kind most people used. I was starting to think I'd stumbled onto some kind of historical reenactment camp, maybe a group of people trying to live like pioneers for a weekend. Except this didn't look temporary. The garden, the cabin, the worn path between the well and the door, everything suggested people had been living here for a long time. "Hello," I called again, louder this time. "I'm Ranger Deepwater with the Forest Service. I need to speak with whoever's in charge here." Still no answer. But as I stood there in the afternoon quiet, I started to notice something strange about the silence itself. It was too complete. No bird songs, no insect sounds, no wind rustling through the leaves. The hollow was as quiet as a tomb. I tried my radio again. Still dead. Even my watch had stopped, though I could have sworn it was working fine that morning. Something was very wrong here. But I couldn't put my finger on what. I decided to wait. Whoever lived here would have to come back eventually, and I had a duty to find out who they were and what they were doing in protected wilderness. I found a fallen log at the edge of the clearing, where I could sit and watch the cabin without being too obvious about it. The afternoon stretched on. The sun moved across the sky, but something felt off about its path. It seemed to be moving too slowly, like the day was lasting longer than it should. I kept checking my watch, forgetting it had stopped. Around what I guessed was 4 o'clock, I heard something. Voices, distant and soft. They were coming from the far end of the hollow, where the valley narrowed to a point. I stood up and saw them. 3 people were walking toward the cabin, a man, a woman, and a child. Even from a distance, I could tell something was strange about them. They moved with an unhurried pace, like people who had nowhere else to be. The man wore dark pants and a white shirt with suspenders. The woman's dress was long and plain, like the clothes on the line. The child skipped alongside them, carefree. They saw me when they were still 50 yards away. The man raised his hand in greeting, not surprised or alarmed to find a stranger in their clearing. They approached slowly, and as they got closer, I could see their faces clearly. They looked normal enough. The man was maybe 40, with dark hair and a beard. The woman was younger, with her hair pinned back in a simple style. The child was a girl, perhaps 8 or 9 years old. But there was something about them that made my skin crawl. They looked too perfect, too calm, like people in an old photograph. "Good afternoon," the man said when they reached me. His voice was quiet and polite. "You're the ranger Pete Morrison told us about." That stopped me cold. "Pete told you I was coming?" The man nodded. "Word travels fast in these mountains. We don't get many visitors." "I'm Ranger Deepwater," I said, showing my badge. "I need to ask you some questions about your occupancy here. This is protected wilderness." "And we know," the woman said softly. "We've been here a long time." "How long?" The man and woman looked at each other. "It's hard to say," the man replied. "Time moves different here." That was a strange thing to say, but I pressed on. "I need to see some identification, and I need to know if you have permits for this structure." The child tugged on the woman's dress. "Mama, can I show him the garden?" "Hush, Sarah," the woman said. "Garden's impressive," I said, trying to keep things friendly. "Mind telling me how you get vegetables to grow so well in mountain soil?" "Old ways," the man said simply. "We know the land." I was getting nowhere with questions, so I decided to be direct. "I'm going to have to ask you to pack up and leave. This is protected wilderness, and permanent structures aren't allowed." The man's face didn't change expression. "We can't do that." "Sir, I don't think you understand. I'm a federal law enforcement officer. This isn't a request." "We understand," the woman said. "But we can't leave. This is our home." The child had wandered over to my radio, which was clipped to my belt. She reached out to touch it, and I stepped back. "That won't work here," she said matter-of-factly. "Why not?" "Nothing from outside works here," she said. "Not for long." I tried the radio again, just to prove her wrong. Still dead. I looked at my watch. Still stopped. "What do you mean, nothing from outside works?" The man gestured toward the cabin. "Why don't you come inside? We'll explain what we can." Every instinct I had told me not to go into that cabin, but I was curious, and I was still thinking like a law enforcement officer. These people seemed harmless enough, and I needed to understand what was going on before I decided how to handle the situation. The inside of the cabin was like stepping into a museum. Everything was handmade and old-fashioned. Wooden furniture, oil lamps, a cast-iron stove. But it was clean and comfortable, lived in. The woman put a kettle on the stove, while the man gestured for me to sit at a wooden table. "We don't get visitors often," the man said. "The last one was, when was it, Mary?" 3 years ago, the woman replied. "That hiker who got lost. What happened to him?" "He found his way out," the man said. "Eventually." The child sat across from me at the table, staring with bright, curious eyes. "Are you going to stay?" she asked. "Just visiting," I said. "That's what they all say at first." The woman brought me a cup of tea. It was hot and sweet, with herbs I didn't recognize. "What's your name?" I asked the man. "Thomas," he said. "This is my wife, Mary, and our daughter, Sarah. How long have you lived here?" Thomas and Mary exchanged that look again. "We came here when Sarah was born," Thomas said. "She's been 8 years old for a while now." "What do you mean?" "Time doesn't move the same way here," Mary explained. "We don't age like people do outside." I stared at them. "That's impossible." "Drink your tea," Sarah said. "It helps people understand." I looked down at the cup in my hands. The tea smelled wonderful, but suddenly I wasn't sure I should drink it. "What kind of herbs did you use?" "Mountain herbs," Mary said. "Nothing harmful. They just help visitors see things clearly." I set the cup down without drinking. "I think I need to head back before dark." "It's already dark," Sarah said. I looked toward the windows. She was right. Somehow, while we'd been talking, night had fallen. But that was impossible. It had been afternoon when I came inside, and we'd only been talking for maybe 20 minutes. "How long have I been here?" "Time moves different," Thomas said again. "We tried to tell you." I stood up quickly, my chair scraping against the wooden floor. "I need to go." "Now, you can try," Mary said sadly, "but you won't find your way out in the dark. The paths change at night." I headed for the door, my heart pounding. This was all wrong. The timing, the stopped watch, the people who didn't age. I needed to get back to civilization and report what I'd found. Outside, the hollow was pitch black except for the light spilling from the cabin windows. I couldn't see the slopes I'd climbed down that afternoon. I couldn't even see the well, though I knew it was only 20 feet away. I pulled out my flashlight and clicked it on. Nothing. The batteries were dead, though they'd been fresh that morning. "The batteries don't last here either," Sarah called from the doorway. "Nothing from outside does." I stood in the darkness, completely lost in a place I'd been just hours before. The hollow felt different at night, bigger somehow, with sounds I couldn't identify coming from the darkness beyond the cabin's light. "Come back inside," Thomas called. "You can leave in the morning." I didn't have much choice. I couldn't find my way out in complete darkness, and my equipment wasn't working. I went back inside, but I didn't sit down. "What is this place?" I demanded. "It's a hollow," Mary said simply. "A place between places." "What does that mean?" "Some places are thin," Thomas explained. "The boundary between what is and what was, what's real and what's possible. This hollow is one of those places." "That's nonsense." "Is it?" Sarah asked. "Then why doesn't your watch work? Why can't you find your way out?" I didn't have an answer for that. I spent the night in the cabin, though I didn't sleep much. Thomas and Mary gave me a blanket and let me rest on a wooden bench by the fireplace. Every few hours, I tried my radio and my flashlight, hoping they'd start working again. They never did. The family went about their evening routine as if having a stranded ranger in their home was perfectly normal. Mary prepared a simple dinner of vegetables from their garden and bread that tasted like it was baked that day. Thomas sat by the fire, carving something from a piece of wood. Sarah played with a doll made of corn husks and scraps of cloth. They offered to share their food, but I declined. I had trail rations in my pack, and something told me I shouldn't eat anything that came from this place. "You're afraid," Sarah observed as I ate a Benergy bar from my pack. "I'm cautious," I corrected. "Same thing," she said. "The last visitor was afraid too. He wouldn't eat our food for 3 days. What happened after 3 days?" "He got hungry enough," Thomas said, without looking up from his carving. "As the night wore on, I started hearing things outside the cabin. Footsteps circling the building, voices talking in the distance, though I couldn't make out words. Sometimes it sounded like music, old fiddle tunes played slowly, like a record running down. "Who else lives here?" I asked. "Neighbors," Mary said. "This hollow's been home to folks for a long time." "How many neighbors?" "Hard to say. People come and go. Some stay, some don't." Around midnight, someone knocked on the door. 3 slow, measured knocks. Thomas went to answer it. An old woman stood in the doorway, bent with age but with bright, alert eyes. She wore a long, dark dress and carried an oil lamp. "Brought some herbs for the visitor," she said, her voice crackling like dry leaves. She looked directly at me. "For his understanding." "Much obliged, Granny Colton," Mary said, taking a small cloth bag from the woman. The old woman studied me for a long moment. "He's got the look," she said finally. "What look?" I asked. "The look of someone who's starting to see. Most folks who find this place, do, sooner or later." She turned to go, then stopped. "Your people outside are looking for you. They won't find you till you're ready to be found." After she left, I tried to process what she'd said. "My people are looking for me?" "Your ranger station," Thomas explained. "When you don't report in, they'll send search teams." "How do you know that?" "We've seen it before. They'll search these mountains for weeks. They'll walk right past this hollow and never see it." "That's impossible." "You keep saying that word," Sarah said. "Maybe you should stop using it here." I tried to stay awake all night, but exhaustion finally won. I dozed off on the bench sometime before dawn. I woke to the smell of bacon and eggs. Morning sunlight was streaming through the windows, and Mary was cooking breakfast on the wood stove. "Feeling better?" she asked. I sat up, my neck stiff from sleeping on the wooden bench. My watch was still stopped, my radio still dead. But in daylight, the hollow looked normal again. I could see the slopes I'd climbed down the day before. "I need to leave," I said. "Now." "Of course," Thomas said. "We'll show you the way out." But when we stepped outside, something was wrong. The hollow looked the same, but different somehow. The garden was bigger than it had been the day before. There were more vegetables, different types I hadn't noticed. The cabin looked older, more weathered. "Did you change something?" I asked. "Nothing changes here," Mary said, "but sometimes visitors see more clearly after a night's rest." Thomas led me toward the slopes, but the path I'd taken down wasn't there anymore. Instead, there was a different trail, one that led in what seemed like the right direction, but felt completely wrong. "This isn't the way I came," I said. "There are many ways in and out," Thomas explained. "The hollow chooses which path you take." We climbed for what felt like hours. The trail switchbacked up the steep slope, but it seemed to go on forever. My legs should have been tired, but they weren't. I should have been breathing hard, but I wasn't even winded. Halfway up the slope, we met another family coming down. A man and woman with 2 children, all dressed in clothes that looked like they belonged in a different century entirely. The man wore a long coat and a tall hat. The woman's dress had puffy sleeves and reached all the way to the ground. "Morning, Thomas," the man said, tipping his hat. "Morning, Jacob. This is Ranger Deepwater. He's visiting." The man named Jacob looked me up and down, taking in my uniform and equipment. "Ranger," he said thoughtfully. "Haven't seen one of those in, how long would you say, Rebecca?" 20 years, maybe 30, the woman replied. "Time's hard to track." Their children stared at me with the same bright, curious eyes as Sarah. The boy, who looked about 10, pointed at my belt. "What's that thing?" "Radio," I said. "Does it work?" "Not here." The boy nodded sagely. "Nothing from outside works here. Papa says it's because this place remembers the old times." After they passed, I grabbed Thomas's arm. Who are they? How long have they been here? The Kellys came here during the Civil War, Thomas said casually. Jacob was a deserter. They've been here ever since. That was over 100 years ago. Time moves different here, Thomas said for what felt like the 100th time. Haven't you figured that out yet? We continued climbing. The trail seemed to loop back on itself sometimes, but Thomas assured me we were making progress. After what felt like hours, we finally reached the top of the ridge. I expected to see familiar mountains and valleys spreading out below me. Instead, I saw nothing but thick white fog rolling through the trees. Where's the outside? I asked. Behind the fog, Thomas said. You just have to walk through. The fog bank was only about 50 feet wide, but stepping into it felt like stepping into another world. The temperature dropped, and the air became thick and humid. I couldn't see more than a foot in any direction. Just keep walking straight, Thomas called from behind me. His voice sounded distant, even though he was right there. I took a few more steps and suddenly broke through into clear air. I was standing on a ridge I recognized, looking down at familiar valleys. My radio immediately crackled to life with static. Ranger Deepwater, this is Base. Do you copy? I grabbed the radio. Base, this is Deepwater. I copy. Deepwater, where the hell are you? You missed your check-in yesterday. We've got search teams looking for you. Yesterday? I looked at my watch. It was running again, showing 10:30 a.m. According to the radio chatter, I'd been missing for 36 hours. But I'd only been in the hollow for one night. I turned to look back, but fog bank was gone. So was Thomas. I was standing alone on a ridge, looking down at empty forest. There was no sign of the trail we'd climbed, no sign of the hollow below. I hiked back to the ranger station in a daze. My supervisor, Frank Miller, was waiting for me with a cup of coffee and a lot of questions. Where the hell were you, Josh? We had teams combing those mountains for 2 days. I sat down and tried to think of what to say. The truth sounded insane, even to me. I found some illegal campers in Kettle Hollow, spent the night observing them. Kettle Hollow? Frank pulled out a topographic map and spread it on the desk. You mean this area here? He pointed to a spot marked with contour lines. I looked at the map. According to the markings, Kettle Hollow was nothing but a steep-sided ravine with no flat ground for camping. Certainly no room for a cabin and garden. That's not right, I said. There's a valley there. A clearing with a cabin. Frank studied my face. Josh, are you feeling okay? You look like you've seen a ghost. I spent the next 2 hours writing my report. I described finding illegal campers, but left out most of the details. Just said I'd observed them from a distance, and they'd left during the night. Frank filed it away without much interest, but I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. Over the next few days, I researched everything I could about Kettle Hollow and the surrounding area. What I found made my blood run cold. In the local historical society, I found records dating back to the 1800s. Multiple mentions of families who had disappeared into the mountains during times of trouble. During the Civil War, several families had vanished after Union soldiers came looking for Confederate deserters. During the Great Depression, more families had simply walked into the wilderness and never come out. The records all mentioned the same thing. These people had last been seen heading toward what the old-timers called the Hidden Hollow. I also found newspaper clippings from the 1,960 seconds about a hiker who'd gone missing for 3 weeks. When he was finally found, he claimed he'd been staying with mountain folk who lived in the old ways. Search teams had found him wandering alone on a ridge, dehydrated and confused. He kept insisting there was a settlement in a hidden valley, but no one believed him. The more I researched, the more I realized I hadn't stumbled onto simple squatters. I'd found something else entirely. Something that had been hidden in those mountains for over a century. 2 weeks after my experience, I decided to go back. I needed to know if it had been real or if I'd somehow hallucinated the whole thing. I told Frank I was doing a follow-up investigation in the Kettle Hollow area. The hike took longer this time. I spent hours searching for the way down into the valley, but I couldn't find it. The slopes were too steep, covered with loose rock and fallen trees. According to my GPS, I was in exactly the right spot, but there was no hollow, just a narrow ravine that matched what was shown on the maps. I was about to give up when I noticed something carved into the bark of an old oak tree. Letters, weathered but still readable. TK plus MK, 1863. Thomas and Mary. They had been here. But when I looked closer, I realized something else. The carving was old. Really old. The bark had grown around the letters, the way it does when a carving has been there for decades. That's when I heard the music. Faint fiddle tunes drifting on the wind, coming from somewhere down in the ravine. I followed the sound, climbing over fallen logs and through thick brush. The music led me to a gap between two boulders that I hadn't noticed before. I squeezed through the gap and found myself looking down into the hidden valley. The hollow was there, just as I remembered it. The cabin, the garden, the smoke rising from the chimney, and people moving around in the clearing below. But something was different. There were more people than before. Families in clothing from different time periods, all going about their daily business, children playing, women hanging laundry, men working in expanded gardens. I recognized Thomas and Mary among them, and Sarah, still looking exactly 8 years old. I climbed down into the hollow, and once again, my watch stopped and my radio went dead. But this time, I was ready for it. Thomas saw me coming and walked over to greet me. "Ranger Deepwater, we wondered when you'd be back." "How did you know I'd come back?" "They always do," he said simply. "The ones who find this place, they can't stay away." "What is this place, really?" Thomas gestured toward the other families. "It's a refuge. A place for people who don't fit in the outside world anymore. We came here during the war. My war, anyway." Mary was pregnant with Sarah, and the soldiers were burning out. Anyone they thought might be helping the other side. The Civil War? That's right. We heard stories about a hidden valley where time moved slow, where people could wait out the troubles. We found it just before Sarah was born. I looked around at the other families. And them? Different troubles, different times. The Kellys came during the same war. The Morrisons came during the hard times in the 30s. The Hendersons came when the government was building the interstate through their land. But how is this possible? An old woman approached us. The same one who had visited the cabin that first night. "Some places are thin, boy," she said in her crackling voice. The Cherokee knew about them. The old-timers who came after knew too. Places where time pools like water in a quiet eddy. "This is Granny Colton," Thomas explained. "She's been here the longest." "How long?" I asked. The old woman laughed. "I came here in 1823, when I was just 16. My daddy was running from the law, and we needed a place to hide. Found this hollow and never left." I stared at her. If she was telling the truth, she was over 180 years old. "The hollow takes care of its own," she continued. "We don't age much here. Don't die of the usual things. But we can't leave, not for long. The outside world moves too fast for us now." "What do you mean?" "Try leaving," Thomas said. "Really leaving. Go back to your regular life. See what happens." I spent the afternoon talking with the families in the hollow. Each had a similar story. They'd come here fleeing some kind of trouble, war, poverty, persecution, loss. The hollow had taken them in, kept them safe, kept them young. But it had also kept them isolated from the world outside. As evening approached, I knew I had to make a decision. I could leave and report what I'd found, bring in teams of researchers and government officials, turn the hollow into a science project, or I could keep the secret. "What happens if I tell people about this place?" I asked Granny Colton. "Then it won't be hidden anymore," she said sadly. "And we'll have to move on, find another thin place if one exists." "Where would you go?" "Don't know. Might not be anywhere left for folk like us. The world's getting too connected, too watched. This might be the last place like it." I thought about the families I'd met. They weren't hurting anyone. They were just trying to live their lives in peace, preserving old ways and old knowledge. Did I have the right to destroy that? That night, I made my choice. I left the hollow the next morning and filed my final report. Kettle Hollow was uninhabited wilderness, unsuitable for camping or development. Difficult to access, poor soil, no water sources. Not worth further investigation. Frank accepted the report without question. The case was closed. But my relationship with the hollow wasn't over. Every few months, I find myself hiking, back to that hidden valley. Sometimes I can find it, sometimes I can't. It depends, Thomas tells me, on how much I need to be there. The families always welcome me back. I've watched their community grow as new refugees find their way to the hidden place. A family from the 1952nd who lost their farm to a dam project. A Vietnam veteran who couldn't adjust to civilian life. An old woman whose mountain home was demolished for a shopping mall. They all have the same look in their eyes, people who've stepped outside of time to preserve something precious. I've learned things in the Hollow that they don't teach at the Ranger Academy. Old skills, old knowledge, old ways of reading the land. The families there remember how people lived before electricity and highways, before the world got so fast and loud. Sometimes I bring them news from outside. They want to know about the world they left behind, but they don't want to rejoin it. They've found something better, a place where time moves at the speed of seasons instead of the speed of clocks. My supervisor started noticing changes in me after a few months. I was calmer, more patient, better at reading the moods of the mountains. When other rangers encountered situations they couldn't explain, strange lights, voices in empty valleys, footprints that led nowhere, they started coming to me for advice. I never told them about the Hollow directly, but I taught them what Granny Colton had taught me. Some places are thin, some mysteries are meant to stay mysterious. And sometimes the best thing a law enforcement officer can do is know when not to enforce the law. Last month, I got a call about smoke rising from an uninhabited valley about 30 miles north of Kettle Hollow. A hiker had reported seeing lights and hearing music where no one should have been living. I told my supervisor I'd investigate, but I already knew what I'd find, or rather, what I'd report not finding. The mountains are full of hidden places, and they're all running out of room to hide. Every year, there are more roads, more development, more people with cameras and GPS units and satellites watching from space. The thin places are getting thinner, and the refuges are getting smaller. But as long as I'm a ranger in these mountains, I'll make sure some secrets stay secret. Some folks deserve to live outside of time, preserving the old ways for anyone wise enough to seek them out. If you ever find yourself hiking in the Blue Ridge Mountains and you smell wood smoke where there shouldn't be any, or hear fiddle music drifting from an empty valley, you might want to think twice before investigating. Some doors, once opened, can't be closed again. And some paths, once walked, lead places you might not want to leave. The Hollow folk are still out there, waiting patiently in the spaces between what is and what was. They'll be there long after the rest of us have forgotten what it means to live by. The rhythm of seasons instead of clocks. Time moves different in the hidden places, and sometimes if you're lucky, or unlucky, you might find one of them calling your name. Just remember, once you've tasted that kind of peace, the outside world never quite fits the same way again. I should know. I've been aging slower ever since my first visit to the Hollow, and every month, it gets a little harder to care about the fast, loud world beyond the mountains. The Hollow folk are patient, they can wait, and they're always looking for new neighbors. My name is Rebecca Stormcrow, and I've been pulling climbers off these rock faces for 16 years. When you work search and rescue in Pisgah National Forest, you see things that would make most people never want to touch granite again. Broken bones, hypothermia, falls that should have killed someone but didn't. I've rappelled down 1,000 cliff faces and hauled up bodies both dead and alive. But I never believed rocks could be alive until Painter's Rock showed me different. It was February 1991, middle of the worst ice storm we'd seen in a decade. The whole mountain was coated in glass, every surface slick and deadly. Any sane person would stay inside, but climbers aren't sane people. We got 3 calls that week about folks stuck on the granite domes around Looking Glass Rock. 2 we brought down easy enough. The 3rd call changed everything. "Rebecca, you need to get up to Painter's Rock," dispatch crackled through my radio. Got some climbers reporting vandalism on the main face. Painter's Rock sits about a half-mile from the main Looking Glass Dome, a massive chunk of granite that rises 4,000 feet above the valley floor. It's a technical climb even in good weather, and in ice storm conditions, it might as well be on the moon. But vandalism on protected rock formations is serious business. Cherokee petroglyphs cover parts of these mountains, and we don't mess around with people damaging cultural sites. I loaded my pack with extra rope, ice axes, and medical supplies. My partner Jake was down with flu, so I'd be going solo. Not ideal, but I'd climbed Painter's Rock so many times I could probably do it blindfolded. Every handhold, every crack, every place where the granite shifted from solid to sketchy, I knew it all. The hike to the base took 2 hours through snow and ice. By the time I reached the rock face, my fingers were numb despite thick gloves. Painter's Rock loomed above me, a wall of gray granite disappearing into low clouds. Ice covered most of the surface, but I could see dark marks on the stone about 40 feet up. From the ground, they looked like fresh scratches or paint marks. I set my anchors and started climbing. The rock felt different under my hands, warmer than it should have been, even through my gloves. Ice should have made the granite feel like touching a freezer, but this felt almost alive. Body temperature. I shook it off. Adrenaline does weird things to your senses when you're on a wall. 40 feet up, I reached the marks the climbers had reported. What I saw there made me stop breathing for a full 10 seconds. These weren't scratches or paint marks, they were petroglyphs, ancient symbols carved deep into the stone. But that was impossible. This section of Painter's Rock had been climbed hundreds of times. Every route had been photographed and mapped. If petroglyphs existed here, someone would have documented them decades ago. More troubling, the symbols were carved right through fresh chalk marks. White climbing chalk marked every good handhold on this route. Climbers had been using these exact spots for years. But the petroglyphs cut through the chalk like they'd been carved yesterday, clean edges showing fresh granite underneath. I pulled out my radio. Dispatch, this is Stormcrow. I'm at the vandalism site on Painter's Rock. We've got a problem. These aren't fresh scratches. They look like genuine petroglyphs, but they're in a location that should have been documented years ago. Static answered me. I tried again. Nothing. Radio dead zones weren't unusual in the mountains, but I'd never lost signal at this exact spot before. I'd called in from here dozens of times during rescues. I studied the symbols more closely. Spiral patterns, animal shapes, and something that looked like a human figure with arms raised toward the sky. The style matched Cherokee petroglyphs I'd seen in other parts of the forest, but the carving looked too fresh, too clean. Below the symbols, someone had scratched a word in English. Warning. A chunk of ice broke loose somewhere above me and clattered down the rock face. I looked up but couldn't see anything through the clouds, just granite and more granite, disappearing into gray sky. That's when I noticed something that made my blood freeze. The rock face above the petroglyphs was warm. Not just warm, actually steaming in the cold air. Thin wisps of vapor rose from the granite like breath on a winter morning. I'd been climbing for 20 years. Rock doesn't steam. Not in February. Not ever. I touched the stone again, pulling off my glove to feel it skin to skin. The granite was definitely warm, maybe 70 degrees, while the air temperature hovered around 20. It felt like touching living flesh. That's when I heard the first sound. Deep inside the rock, so low I felt it more than heard it, came something like a heartbeat. Slow, steady, rhythmic. The entire rock face vibrated slightly with each pulse. I jerked my hand back and nearly lost my grip. Rocks don't have heartbeats. I rappelled down as fast as safely possible, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped my gear twice. By the time I reached the ground, I'd convinced myself I was experiencing altitude sickness or hypothermia hallucinations. Mountains can mess with your head when you're alone and stressed. But when I got back to the ranger station, my radio started working perfectly. Dispatch, this is Stormcrow. I need to speak with someone from Cherokee Cultural Affairs. We've got petroglyphs on Painter's Rock that weren't there last month. Copy that, Rebecca. Anything else unusual? I paused, finger on the radio button. How do you report that a rock face feels alive? Negative, just the petroglyphs. The next morning brought clear skies and temperatures just above freezing. Perfect climbing weather. I returned to Painter's Rock with Tom Bearstep, a Cherokee elder who worked with the Forest Service on cultural preservation issues. Tom had been documenting petroglyphs in these mountains for 30 years. If anyone could explain what I'd found, it would be him. The hike up went smoothly, and Tom climbed like someone half his 58 years. When we reached the base of Painter's Rock, He stopped and tilted his head like he was listening to something. "This place feels different," he said quietly. "Different how?" "Awake." I set anchors for both of us, and we climbed to the petroglyph site together. In daylight, the symbols looked even more impossible. They were definitely old. The carving style and weathering patterns matched petroglyphs Tom had shown me elsewhere. But the location made no sense. Tom studied the symbols for 10 minutes without speaking. Finally, he looked at me with worried eyes. "These are danger warnings, very old ones. They're telling people to stay away from this place." "Stay away from what?" "The sleeping one. The stone spirit." Tom traced one of the spiral patterns with his finger. "My grandfather told stories about places like this. Rocks that dream. When they wake up, they try to warn people." "Warn them about what?" "About dying." Tom pointed to the symbol that looked like a human figure. "This isn't just a person. It's someone falling. The other marks, they're telling the story of what happens when the rock spirit wakes up. First, it tries to communicate. Then it tries to protect people. Then..." He didn't finish the sentence. "Tom, rocks don't dream, rocks don't communicate." He looked at me steadily. "Then explain how these symbols appeared overnight on a rock face that's been climbed 1,000 times." I couldn't. We were getting ready to rappel down when we heard voices below. 3 climbers were setting up gear at the base of the rock, preparing to attempt the same route where we'd found the petroglyphs. "Hey," I called down. "This route is temporarily closed for cultural survey." One of them looked up. "Come on, Rebecca, we drove 4 hours to climb this thing." I recognized the voice. Danny Martinez, a strong climber from Charlotte who'd been coming here for years. He was with 2 people I didn't know, a woman about 30 with short blonde hair and a young guy who looked maybe 20. "Sorry, Danny. Forest Service orders. Try the south face instead." "The south face is still covered in ice. This is the only climbable route today." Tom grabbed my arm. "Let them climb," he whispered. "What? Why?" "Because the spirit wants to show us something. The warnings aren't random. Something's coming. I'm not letting climbers risk their lives based on 3 people are going to fall today," Tom said quietly. "The petroglyphs show 3 figures falling. We can't stop what's already been carved in stone, but maybe we can understand why." Against every instinct I had as a ranger, I let them climb. Danny led the route while his 2 companions followed. They were good climbers, experienced and careful. I watched through binoculars as they moved up the rock face, following the same path Tom and I had taken. Everything went normally until they reached the petroglyphs. Danny stopped climbing and called down to us. "Rebecca, you need to see this." "What is it?" "The holds are wrong." Tom and I looked at each other. "Wrong how?" I shouted back. "The hand holds I've been using for 3 years, they're in different places. It's like the rock face changed." That was impossible. Granite doesn't change. Granite doesn't move. Granite is the most stable rock formation on Earth. But as I watched through binoculars, I saw Danny reach for a handhold that should have been there, a distinctive crystal formation I'd used dozens of times. His hand grasped empty air. The crystal formation had moved 6 inches to the left. Danny's partner, the blonde woman, called down next. "The route's completely different up here. It's like climbing a totally new rock." I started climbing immediately, with Tom right behind me. By the time we reached them, all 3 climbers were standing on a ledge that shouldn't have existed. The entire rock face had somehow rearranged itself. "How long have you been climbing this route, Danny?" Tom asked. 3 years. I know every inch of this wall. These holds, this ledge, that crack system over there. None of this was here last month. It's like the rock grew new features overnight." The young climber, who'd been quiet until now, pointed to something above us. "What's that?" We all looked up. About 20 feet higher, a new petroglyph had appeared. This one was different from the others. Larger, more detailed, more urgent. It showed the same falling figure. But now there were symbols around it that looked like numbers. Tom studied the new carving. "It's a date," he said finally. "Today's date." "That's impossible," the blonde woman said. "You can't carve stone that fast. These markings would take hours with power tools." "Unless the stone is carving itself," Tom replied. As if responding to his words, the rock face beneath our feet began to vibrate, gently at first. then stronger. The vibration had that same rhythmic quality I'd felt the day before, like a massive heartbeat. "We need to get off this rock," I said, "now." But when Danny tried to rappel, his rope wouldn't hold. The anchor points he'd set in solid cracks had somehow become loose. The granite around his protection had crumbled, leaving his safety gear hanging by threads. "My anchors are failing," he called out, voice tight with fear. "The rock is falling apart around my protection." I looked at Tom. "The spirit doesn't want them to leave," he said quietly. "Why not?" "Because something worse is coming. The rock is trying to keep them safe." We were trapped on a ledge that shouldn't exist, on a rock face that was apparently alive, with safety equipment failing for no reason that made any sense. As a search and rescue ranger, I'd trained for a lot of emergency scenarios. None of them covered dealing with conscious geological formations. "Everyone stay calm," I said, using my most professional voice while my mind raced through options. "We'll set new anchors and get down one at a time." I pulled out my gear and looked for solid cracks to place protection. But every spot I tested crumbled at the slightest pressure. The rock that had been solid granite for millions of years was suddenly soft as chalk. Danny's young climbing partner, he'd introduced himself as Mike, was starting to panic. "This is insane. Rocks don't just change. There has to be a logical explanation." "Look up," Tom said quietly. Above us, new petroglyphs were appearing in real time. We watched lines carve themselves into the granite, with no visible tool, no human hand. The symbols formed slowly but steadily, like an invisible finger drawing in wet sand. The new symbols were different from the earlier ones. These looked like maps. Topographical lines, elevation markers, geological features. And running through the center of each map was a jagged line that could only represent one thing: a fault line. "Oh no," I breathed, understanding hitting me like a physical blow. "Tom, how long have these Cherokee stories been around, the ones about stone spirits that try to warn people?" "Generations. My great-grandfather heard them from his great-grandfather. Maybe 200 years of stories." I thought about the geology surveys I'd read, the reports on seismic activity in the Appalachian Mountains. The last major earthquake in this area was 1886. Before that, 1755. They happen every 120 to 140 years. "We're overdue," Tom said grimly. The blonde climber, Sarah, she'd said, was examining the newest petroglyphs with a geologist's eye. "If these are accurate, there's a previously unknown fault line running directly under this entire mountain range. A movement here would trigger rock slides for miles." As if summoned by her words, the rock face shuddered again. This time, the vibration wasn't rhythmic like a heartbeat. It was irregular, violent, like something massive was trying to break free from deep underground. "The spirit isn't just warning about a rock slide," Tom said, his face pale. "It's warning about the earthquake that's going to cause the rock slide." Small stones began falling from somewhere above us, then larger stones. I looked up and saw impossible cracks spreading across the granite face like a spider web. But these weren't random fractures. They were forming patterns. Symbols, messages. "We need to move," I said. "Now." The rock face is destabilizing. But when Danny tested his gear again, the result was even worse. His rope, rated for thousands of pounds of force, snapped like thread when he put weight on it. The carabiners that should have held our lives in their metal jaws simply opened, without cause, without explanation. "The rock doesn't want us to leave," Mike said, his voice cracking. "It's keeping us here." "Why would it do that?" Sarah demanded. "If there's going to be an earthquake, we need to get to safe ground." Tom was studying the newest set of symbols, his expression growing more troubled by the minute. "These aren't just warnings," he said slowly. "They're instructions." "Instructions for what?" "For how to survive, what's coming. The spirit is trying to teach us something." The petroglyphs showed a sequence of images. People climbing higher on the rock face, not lower. Moving toward a specific formation that looked like a cave or deep crack. Taking shelter inside the rock itself rather than trying to escape it. "That's crazy," Danny said. "If you're going to be an earthquake, the last place you want to be is inside a crack in the rock face." "Unless," I said, understanding beginning to dawn, The rock knows which parts of itself will survive the quake. The vibrations were getting stronger now, coming in waves every few minutes. With each tremor, more cracks appeared in the granite around us. But not all the cracks were spreading randomly. Some were forming very specific shapes, handholds, footholds, a path leading upward toward a formation I'd never noticed before. "Look," Tom pointed. "The rock is showing us where to go." About 60 feet above our current position, a dark opening had appeared in the granite face. Not a natural cave. The edges were too regular, too purposeful. It looked like the rock had opened itself, creating shelter exactly where the petroglyphs indicated it would be. "I've climbed this route dozens of times," Danny said, staring upward. "That cave was never there before." "A lot of Gove, too. Things were never there before," Sarah replied grimly. The falling stones were getting larger and more frequent. One chunk of granite, easily 50 pounds, crashed onto the ledge where we'd been standing just minutes before. If we'd still been there, someone would have died. "We climb up," I decided. "Follow the path the rock is showing us. It's our only chance." "What if the rock is wrong?" Mike asked. "What if we're climbing into a trap?" "Then we die," Tom said simply. "But if we stay here, we die anyway. At least this way, we're trusting something that's been trying to warn people for 200 years. I went first, testing each new hold the rock had provided. The granite felt warm under my hands again, alive and responsive. When I reached for a handhold that looked uncertain, the rock would shift slightly, providing better grip. When my foot slipped on a wet surface, a new foothold would appear exactly where I needed it. The rock was actively helping us climb. One by one, we made our way up the changing face of Painter's Rock. Below us, the route we'd originally climbed was disintegrating, huge chunks of granite peeling away and crashing into the valley. The mountain was shedding its skin, revealing something new and strange underneath. We reached the cave opening just as the first major tremor hit. The entire mountain shook like a wet dog, and the sound, dear God, the sound was like the world breaking apart. Trees snapped, boulders rolled, and somewhere in the distance, we could hear the massive rumble of a rock slide beginning. Inside the cave, we found something that made me question everything I thought I knew about reality. The walls were covered in petroglyphs, but these were different from any Native American rock art I'd ever seen. These symbols moved. They flowed like water across the stone surface, constantly changing, showing different scenes, different warnings, different instructions. And in the deepest part of the cave, carved into the back wall, was a face. A human face, ancient and wise and impossibly sad. Its eyes were closed, but as we watched, they slowly opened. The face looked directly at Tom and began to speak. Not with words, but with vibrations that we felt in our bones, meaning that appeared directly in our minds. "The earth moves. The mountain falls. Many will die unless warned. Help me warn them. Help me save them. Asterisk." The voice of the stone spirit filled our minds without sound, ancient and desperate and utterly alien. I'd experienced a lot of impossible things in my life, but having a conversation with a rock face redefined the boundaries of reality. "I have slept for many seasons," the spirit continued, its carved features somehow conveying emotion despite being made of granite. Asterisk, but the earth shake comes early this time. Too early. The signs were not ready. People will not know to flee. "What do you want us to do?" Tom asked aloud, speaking to the face in the parked wall. "Carry my warning. Tell your people the mountain falls at sunset. Tell them to leave the valley. Tell them the stone spirit remembers the last time the earth moved, when many died because they would not listen." Sarah, practical geologist, even in the face of impossibility, asked the obvious question. "How do we know you're telling the truth? How do we know this isn't some kind of hallucination brought on by stress and altitude?" The face in the wall turned its attention to her. Without warning, the cave filled with images, not on the walls, but somehow projected directly into our minds. We saw the earthquake of 1886, felt the terror of people trapped under falling buildings in Charleston. We experienced the earthquake of 1755, witnessed entire mountains reshaping themselves in minutes. And we saw what was coming. A fault line deep under Pisgah National Forest, stressed beyond its breaking point, ready to unleash energy that had been building for over a century. The rock slide that would follow, would bury the valley floor under millions of tons of debris. Every campground, every hiking trail, every access road would disappear under an avalanche of stone. Sunset, the spirit repeated. When the sun touches the horizon, the earth will break. You must warn them. Asterisk. How many people are in the valley right now? I asked, though I already knew the answer would be bad. February is off-season, but there are still probably 50 to 70 people in the various campgrounds, Sarah said. Plus day hikers, climbers, anyone who might have driven in for the clear weather. Danny checked his watch. It's 2 o'clock now. That gives us 4 hours to evacuate the entire valley floor. Our radios don't work up here, Mike pointed out. How are we supposed to warn anyone? As if responding to his question, the cave began to change again. The floor tilted, creating a slide that led down toward a previously hidden exit. The spirit was providing us with an escape route. Asterisk. Go. Asterisk, it said. Asterisk. I will hold the mountain steady as long as I can. But my strength is not endless. When the sun sets, I must let the earth move. Asterisk. We slid down through the rock, following a tunnel that definitely hadn't existed an hour ago. The passage led us through the heart of Painter's Rock, past chambers filled with moving petroglyphs and walls that pulsed with that same living warmth I'd first felt 2 days ago. We emerged from a crack at the base of the rock that opened just long enough to let us through, then sealed behind us like it had never existed. My radio crackled back to life immediately. Dispatch, this is Stormcrow. I need to speak with the incident commander immediately. We have a major earthquake predicted for sunset today, and we need to evacuate the entire Looking Glass area. Copy that, Rebecca. Did you say earthquake? Confirmed. Magnitude unknown, but sufficient to cause massive rock slides. We need every available unit for emergency evacuation, and we need them now. The next 3 hours were chaos. Getting people to believe in an earthquake prediction based on conversations with a rock spirit was challenging. But the Forest Service has protocols for geological emergencies, and they trust their rangers. When I said evacuate, they evacuated. We cleared the campgrounds first, then swept the hiking trails for day hikers. Danny, Sarah, and Mike helped coordinate the evacuation, each taking responsibility for different trail systems. Tom worked with local authorities to set up roadblocks, preventing new people from entering the area. By 5:30, we'd accounted for everyone except a family of 4 who'd been camping in a remote site near the base of Looking Glass Rock itself. Tom and I hiked in to find them while the others finished clearing the main valley. We found the family, parents, and 2 young kids, just as they were breaking camp. They'd heard the evacuation announcement on Tom, their emergency radio, but weren't taking it seriously. Look, Ranger, the father said, we drove 8 hours to get here for our vacation. 1 night of camping isn't going to kill us. Yes, I said firmly, it actually might. I was trying to convince them to leave when the first tremor hit at exactly 5:47 p.m. Just a small one, barely enough to rattle the trees, but enough to get their attention. Okay, the mother said, grabbing her kids, maybe we should listen to the ranger. We loaded their gear as fast as possible and started hiking out. The trail was 3 miles long, mostly downhill, but with 2 young kids it would take at least an hour. The sun was already touching the mountains on the horizon. We were halfway out when Tom stopped and grabbed my arm. Listen, he said. In the distance, from the direction of Painter's Rock, came a sound like nothing I'd ever heard. Low, mournful, desperate. The cry of something ancient and powerful that had reached the end of its strength. The rock spirit was saying goodbye. The earthquake hit at exactly sunset. I've been through plenty of natural disasters, but nothing prepared me for the violence of the earth suddenly deciding to rearrange itself. The ground didn't just shake. It lurched, pitched, and rolled like we were standing on the deck of a ship in a hurricane. Trees fell everywhere. Boulders rolled down mountainsides like enormous bowling balls. And behind us, visible even through the forest, Painter's Rock was coming apart. Not collapsing, unwinding, like a massive spring that had been wound too tight for too long, finally releasing all its stored energy at once. Chunks of granite, the size of houses, peeled away from the main formation and tumbled into the valley, each impact sending new shockwaves through the ground. We made it out with the family just as the main rock slide began. From the safety of the road, We watched millions of tons of stone pour down the mountainside like a slow-motion waterfall. Everything we'd worked to evacuate, every campsite, every trail, every access road, disappeared under the debris. If we hadn't cleared the area, 70 people would have died. The earthquake lasted 6 minutes. When it was over, the entire valley had been reshaped. Where Painter's Rock had stood for millions of years, only a pile of rubble remained. But in that rubble, if you knew where to look, you could still see faces in the stone. Ancient, wise, and finally at rest. Number Part 5. Resolution and Implications. The official report listed it as a magnitude 5.8 earthquake, with epicenter directly under the Looking Glass area of Pisgah National Forest. The geological survey team that came in afterward confirmed what the rock spirit had shown us: a previously unknown fault line running under the entire mountain range. It's incredible, the lead geologist told me a week later. This fault shows evidence of movement dating back centuries, but somehow it was never detected by any of our surveys. It's almost like the mountain was hiding it from us. I didn't tell him that maybe the mountain was. The evacuation was called a textbook example of emergency response. Every ranger involved got commendations. The media called it a miracle that no one was killed when the unpredictable earthquake struck without warning. Only 5 of us knew the truth about the warning. Tom and I returned to the debris field 3 months later, after the geological surveys were complete and the area had been reopened for limited access. Where Painter's Rock had stood, we found something impossible. The scattered boulders had arranged themselves into patterns, not randomly, not from the chaos of the rock slide, but purposefully. The stones formed spirals, maps, symbols, a final message from the spirit that had saved 70 lives by sacrificing itself. The message was simple: other mountains dream too. Since then, I've started paying attention to things I used to dismiss. The way certain rock faces feel warm on cold days, the sounds that come from deep inside granite formations on quiet nights, the stories that Cherokee elders tell about mountains that try to communicate with people who know how to listen. Last month, climbers reported new petroglyphs appearing on Blood Mountain in Georgia. The symbols look like warnings. 2 weeks ago, hikers in the Smokies found fresh carvings on a cliff face that had been bare for decades. They show falling rocks and fleeing people. Yesterday, I got a call from a ranger in West Virginia about strange vibrations coming from inside Seneca rocks. The spirits are waking up all through the Appalachians. The earth is moving again, and the mountains are trying to warn us. The question is whether we're wise enough to listen. I've put in for a transfer to the Regional Geological Hazard Assessment Team. My job description doesn't mention communicating with stone spirits, but I figure somebody should be paying attention when the mountains start talking. Because next time, we might not get 4 hours warning. Next time, we might get 4 minutes. And somewhere out there in the ancient peaks of the Appalachian chain, stone faces are carving themselves into rock walls, trying to tell us something we need to hear. The mountains remember the last time the earth shook. They remember what happened to the people who wouldn't listen. They're hoping this time will be different. They're hoping this time we'll learn. But hope, I've discovered, is not something rocks are particularly good at. What they're good at is patience and warning, and when the time comes, sacrifice. The next time you're hiking in the mountains and you put your hand on a rock face that feels unusually warm, don't dismiss it as imagination. Listen carefully. Feel for vibrations that shouldn't be there. The stone might be trying to tell you something. It might be trying to save your life.